Well, good morning, everyone. Can I welcome you to the 8th meeting in 2014 of the Infrastructure and Capital Investment Committee. Can I remind everyone to switch off their mobile phones as they do affect the broadcasting system, but some committee members may be consulting their tablets during the meeting as we provide meeting papers in digital format. We've got quite a lot to get through to today, so agenda item 1 is decision to take business in private. It's to seek the committee's agreement to take item 5, consideration of the evidence heard on and consideration of any future draft reports on the Housing Scotland Bill in private. Is the committee agreed? We are agreed, thank you. The next item of business is to consider the Procurement Reform Bill, Procurement Reform Scotland Bill at stage 2. We have a number of government and non-government amendments to consider today, and although it's hoped that it may be possible to finish this today, time has been set aside at the committee's meeting next week, the 19th of March, to complete the stage 2 process if needed. So can I welcome Nicola Sturgeon, Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities, and her supporting officials. Can I remind members that the Cabinet Secretary's officials are here in a strictly supportive capacity and cannot speak during proceedings or be questioned by members. Members should have a copy of the bill, the marshalled list and groupings for today's consideration. So, the question is that section 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yep, we are agreed. I call now contracting authorities. I call Amendment 1 in the name of Tavish Scott, grouped with Amendment 35. Tavish is unable to attend and has given his apologies. Does any other member wish to move Amendment 1 and can speak to the other amendment in the group?
I do, Convener.
James Kelly, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I welcome the opportunity to move Amendment 1 in Tavish Scott's name and Amendment 35 in my own name. I think if you look at the provision of this bill, the extent of it covering £10 billion of public contracts, and you examine what is it the bill is trying to achieve, it's obviously trying to achieve a more efficient process which will boost the economy, support businesses and the public sector, and support jobs, and obviously also support fairness in the economy. It therefore does seem strange that the hubcos covered by the Scottish Futures Trust and also Scottish Water are excluded from the provisions of the bill. The recent Scottish Futures Trust business plan tells us that they are using expenditure of £3.1 billion. Scottish Water, as we know, has a capital expenditure programme of £500 million, and its recent expenditure was £837 million. So therefore, these organisations affect billions of pounds which are running through the economy, much of which will be covered by these contracts. Therefore, it's a glaring omission that they're not included in the provisions of the bill, and what the amendments seek to do is to include these organisations from the point of view that the provisions of the bill would then be covered, and we could make the appropriate changes. We will be bringing forward a number of amendments to this bill which will seek to improve provisions like the living wage, and including Scottish Water and the Scottish Futures Trust. It would ensure a more comprehensive coverage, both for the provisions of the bill and for the positive benefit of the Scottish economy. And in making those comments, I move formally both of these amendments.
Got anything specifically on Amendment 35, or have you sort of included that in what you've just said?
I've basically included. I've taken the two of them
Great.
together.
That's fine, thank you. Any other members wish to contribute? Deputy First Minister.
Thanks, Convener. I think there's an important general point to make in relation to these particular amendments, but it's a comment that is relevant to the bill in general. and that's the need to make sure that the provisions of this bill are consistent with the overarching framework of EU public procurement law. Also, that they don't impose unnecessary or disproportionate burdens on public and private bodies. And lastly, that they are pragmatic and they are deliverable, because clearly that is vital to ensuring that this bill makes the difference we all want it to make. Hubcos, if I can deal with them first, are not designated as public bodies. They are institutionalised public-private partnerships. I mean, for members' information, Hubcos are 60% owned by the private partner, 30% by the participating authority and 10% by the Scottish Futures Trust. And as such, Hubcos are bodies that are created after European-wide competition. Therefore, procurement law already applies in relation to the establishment of Hubcos. However, expecting Hubcos to behave as if they're public bodies would create an anomaly, in the sense it would be applying public procurement rules to private sector bodies, which would also restrict their flexibility to deliver, and that flexibility is, of course, one of the key factors that lies behind their creation. If we can turn to Scottish Water, while Scottish Water is clearly publicly owned, the fact of, and I should say we intend to keep it that way, the fact of the matter is, for procurement purposes, it is a utility and it's subject to a very different overarching framework of European law. And the bill and the subsequent regulations and guidance that we will need to draft requires to dovetail with EU public procurement rules. Indeed, the bill currently does this by excluding utilities contracts, which is entirely consistent with the existing EU procurement law approach, leaving them subject to a separate legal regime. Applying the bill to a body that's subject to a different EU law framework would create risk, it would create complexity for all concerned, as it would require us to work with two different EU regimes. All of that said, I recognise the importance of Scottish Water's procurement activity to our economy. I think in that respect the comments that James Kelly made can't be argued with. My officials have been in dialogue with Scottish Water, and it has provided an assurance that it supports the general principles of the bill and will continue to adhere to its key components. For example, Scottish Water already advertises via PCS, it uses the standard PQQ template, and it uses community benefit clauses in its major contracts. I'm also happy that officials have a similar dialogue with the Scottish Futures Trust in relation to Hubcos, and I would be happy to undertake today to feed back on that dialogue to the committee in advance of stage 3. But in light of all of the comments I would make, I would ask, I was going to ask Tavish Scott to withdraw Amendment 1 and Mr Kelly not to move Amendment 35, but I'll direct both of those comments to Mr Kelly.
Okay, Mr Kelly, to move Amendment 1 and to wind up or press or withdraw your amendment.
Okay, I wish to move Amendment 1 and Amendment 35 and to press both amendments.
One at the moment, that's fine. So the question is that Amendment 1 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. That is not agreed, so we move to a vote. Those in favour of Amendment 1, please show. Those against Amendment 1, please show. And those abstaining. Okay, so that was 2, 4 and 4. Oh, sorry, I beg your pardon, I didn't see your hand. Put it right up in the air then. So that's 3 noes and 3 yeses and 4 noes, so the amendment is not agreed. We call Amendment 35 in the name of James Kelly, already debated with Amendment 1. James Kelly, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 35 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We are not agreed. There will be a vote. So those in favour of Amendment 35, please show. 3. Those against, please show. 4. The amendment is not agreed. The question is then that the schedule be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. That is agreed. Move on to Section 2, meaning of regulated procurement. I call Amendment 4 in the name of the Deputy First Minister, grouped with Amendments 24, 25 and 27. Deputy First Minister, to move Amendment 4 and speak to all amendments in the group.
Amendment 4 is a technical amendment. It It clarifies that the provisions of the bill will apply regardless of whether a procurement involves competitive tendering. Amendments 24, 25 and 27 are consequential on Amendment 4. These amendments are related to the commitment I gave to the committee last December regarding bringing forward an exemption for health and social care contracts, and I'll speak to the amendments on that substantive matter in a later group. They're also related to Amendment 12 on circumstances in which competition is not required, and that will also be debated later. So I move Amendment 4 and ask that the committee supports the other amendments in this group.
Any other members wish to contribute? Do you want to say anything further in winding up, Deputy First Minister? So the question is that Amendment 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. The question is that Section 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. The question is that Section 3 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. Section 4, excluded contracts, resale and research and development. I call Amendment 5 in the name of the Deputy First Minister in a group on its own. Deputy First Minister to move and speak to the amendment.
Amendment 5 responds to concerns that were expressed in evidence before the committee, in particular by the higher and further education sector, regarding the implications of the bill for the award of contracts linked to commercial activity. In particular, there was a concern that higher and further education bodies derive a substantial part of their income from research and development commissions, and that the bill could place them at a competitive disadvantage in pursuing those commissions, especially as changes to funding arrangements in England mean that English higher and further education bodies are likely to come out of the scope of EU public procurement law. The amendment is intended to exempt from the scope of the bill contracts for goods, works or services that are for resale or which are for the principal purpose of research or development. The term principal is important here, as equipment bought for the purpose of research or development might subsequently be used for other purposes, including teaching. However, the exemption will apply where the principal purpose of acquiring the goods, services or works at the point they're purchased is to undertake research or development. The exemption in relation to goods for resale or hire also provides a degree of flexibility for public bodies that undertake quasi-commercial activities, such as, for example, running gift shops or restaurants. Although the concerns that were expressed by the higher and further education sector have not been echoed by other sectors, I think it's right that we do apply the exemptions on a general basis, as other public bodies could conceivably face similar issues. I therefore move Amendment 5 and ask the committee to support it.
Any other members wish to speak on this amendment? Do you want to say anything further, Deputy First Minister? Okay, the question is that Amendment 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Agreed. That is agreed. The question is that Section 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The question then is that Sections 5 to 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. Thank you. We move to Section 8. Consideration to be given to various employment practices. I call Amendment 36 in the name of James Kelly, grouped with Amendments 69, 70, 39, 79, 80 and 81. James Kelly to move Amendment 36 and to speak to all the other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener. I wish to move Amendments 36 and 39 in my name and also speak in support of the other amendments in the group. Amendments 36 and 39 seek to ensure that a living wage is paid in relation to all public contracts covered by the bill. With £10 billion of public contracts covered by the bill, this is an opportunity to implement the living wage across a large extent of the area covered by these contracts. It would give an opportunity to a real positive impact for many workers. There are 400,000 workers who currently are paid the minimum wage but not the living wage. 36% of those are under 25 and indeed 64% are women. 95% of them work in the private sector where many of these contracts would be allocated. And it would give this would be a truly transformational amendment if this were to be accepted, because it would give the opportunity for those who are currently paid the minimum wage a £2,000 wage rise, which would make a real benefit to their lives. I know that all SNP members of the committee have signed up to parliamentary motions supporting the living wage. And I would appeal to them that in supporting these amendments today, it gives a real opportunity to put their support for previous living wage motions actually into action, and that would make a real difference to workers. In terms of the legal issues which come up around stage 1, I would submit that this can be achieved by linking, as my amendment does, the payment of the minimum wage to the performance of the contract. I think it is a matter of political will. This has been done in other areas, and I think surely the Scottish Government can do it, and I would appeal to them to look closely at the amendment and interact with the process. In terms of Amendments 69 and 70 in relation to trade union recognition, I think these are valid points that are made by Ken McIntosh. Trade unions play a vital role, not only in the workplace, but good trade union relations also support the economy, and these amendments help to facilitate that. I think Jackie Bailey's amendment on an equal pay audit sits well with some of the stats I quoted earlier on the living wage, where I showed that 64% of those not paid the living wage are women. And I think there should be an onus on those bidding for the contracts to ensure that they have an equal pay audit in place to enable equal pay provisions. I think Neil Bibby's amendment, Amendment 80, is a very interesting one, because in terms of community benefits, it allows us to introduce a requirement for adequate childcare provision, which not only would be beneficial to employers, but also obviously would support bringing many more women into the workplace, which I know is an aspiration that the Scottish Government share. Amendment 81, Ken McIntosh's amendment in terms of wage ratios. I think this is, again, an interesting area. We're aware of corporations where there's a vast difference between what is paid on the shop floor and what is paid in the boardroom. I think Ken McIntosh's amendment is quite a pragmatic one, in the sense that it doesn't make a blanket provision, but it gives the powers to ministers to make it a provision via regulation, and therefore I think it's well worthy of consideration.
Okay, thank you. Ken McIntosh to speak to Amendment 69 and the other amendments in the group.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for inviting me or allowing me to come along this morning, join you. I want to speak in favour of all the amendments in this group, and specifically to support Amendments 69, 70 and 81 in my own name. So as a grouping of amendments, I would just point out that they provide us with an opportunity to use public procurement as an engine for radical social and economic change. Amendment 69 would allow procuring authorities in awarding contracts to take into account the record of companies in promoting sustainable employment policies. The specific example I had in mind is that of work sharing, or as it is known in Germany, Kurzarbeit. And now I believe that many of us, including the Finance Secretary, have been looking to the Mittelstand in Germany and the way these middle-sized companies have withstood the worst of the recession, and to see what lessons we can learn here in Scotland. One such lesson is undoubtedly work sharing, and that's when a company compensates but temporarily reduces the working week for employees in order to spread a reduced volume of work over the same size workforce and to avoid any large-scale redundancies. It's estimated to have saved up to 400,000 jobs in Germany during the recent recession. And the International Labour Organization highlights similarly impressive numbers of livelihoods saved in Japan, Turkey and in the United States of America. The ILO concludes that not only does work sharing help workers keep their jobs, it helps companies ride out a crisis, retaining the collective workforce experience, which then puts them in a good position to take advantage of any upturn in growth which returns to the economy. Furthermore, as a policy, it helps governments save on the costs and the social impact of unemployment. My amendment is inclusively worded, partly because I believe we should be in a position to reward and incentivise and promote all sustainable employment policies, not just work sharing. However, I am aware that the Cabinet Secretary is moving an amendment later on this morning, Amendment 8, under the section on a sustainable procurement duty, and that will give her the flexibility, complete flexibility, to use guidance to further define sustainable procurement policies and therefore sustainable employment policies. And I would hope that would give her additional comfort should she require it. Amendment 70 is one that I hope the Minister will have no difficulty in accepting and that the committee certainly would recognise and wish to promote, in that it simply encourages public contractors to recognise trade unions. As well as drawing to the committee's attention my own trade union membership, I would want to particularly thank the trade union community for their role in bringing this issue forward. The Minister will know from the many times I have raised this subject in Parliament that I believe it is quite wrong to award government grants, in other words taxpayers' money, to companies such as Amazon who refuse to recognise trade unions. If we want to promote a more moral economy here in Scotland, we have to try and reflect the values that we hold dear, not simply shareholder return or obeisance to market values, but long-term thinking, a commitment to local communities and, as expressed in this amendment, respect and support for worker representation. This is not just about weeding out the bad apples. Both improving health and safety would be one of the benefits, because workplaces that recognise trade unions are proven to be safer. They are also crucial to improving our productivity. And I would point to both the shipbuilding industry and the Scottish rail industry as an example in point where strong trade union relationships have been vital in delivering the rail franchise. Now, it was actually disappointing that the trade union recognition wasn't part of the rail franchise renewal process, but here is an opportunity for the Scottish Government to nail its colours firmly to the mast in promoting the role of trade unions in building a more sustainable economy. Now, the final amendment in my name in this section is Amendment 81 on wage ratios, or wage differentials as some may call them. This particular measure is supported by Oxfam, amongst others, and is one of a range of actions we can take to support the whole concept of decent work. In this section alone, there are proposals before the committee to support the living wage, equal pay and childcare. This amendment allows the Scottish Government to promote equality, encouraging employers to minimise wage ratios between the highest and the lowest paid. Now, Convener, in 2012, the average chief executive of a FTSE 100 company was paid £4.8 million per year. That's 185 times the average salary in this country. And this has risen from 1.2 million just back in 1999. It comes at a time when wages for most people have either been stagnating or worse. In 2010, take-home pay fell for the first time in 30 years. Now, according to the Equality Trust, wage ratios in the voluntary sector are estimated to be around 10 to 1. In the public sector, they are roughly 15 to 1. But in the private sector, in FTSE 100 companies, they are approximately 262 to 1. In other words, although more can be done in the public and voluntary sectors, it's clear that earnings inequality in the private sector will have to be tackled in order to create a fairer, more equal society. Now, not only would this amendment help do so, it might also encourage the voluntary sector, social enterprises and local SMEs to bid for and win more public sector contracts. If we look specifically at employers with large public sector contracts, one such company would be Serco. Their previous chief executive was paid an estimated £3.1 million in 2010, 6 times more than the highest paid UK public servant, 11 times more than the highest paid local authority chief executive. Now, Cabinet Secretary, even David Cameron has suggested that no one in a public sector organisation should earn more than 20 times more than their lowest paid colleague. The Equality Trust estimates that none of the large public service industry organisations paid their chief exec less than 59 times UK median earnings. It's clear that we need to tackle pay inequality in this field if we are to have any impact on inequality more widely. And there are good examples too. I would just cite the example of Tullis Russell or Triodos Bank, both here in Scotland. Convener, I think it's worth highlighting and adding that the IMF, that's the International Monetary Fund, recently highlighted that lower net inequality is robustly correlated with faster and more durable growth for a given level of redistribution. In other words, this is a pro-business, pro-growth, sustainable economic policy. Convener, I am asking for the committee's support for all the amendments in this section, as well as the 3 I have specifically outlined. I believe we share a desire to build a more resilient economy, one which emphasises the importance of an ethical and values-based approach to employment and business practices. The Scottish Government has made a very good start with the introduction of the National Performance Framework. I have said before that demanding social responsibility from companies large or small will not scare away good employers. It will provide the backbone for a more sustainable long-term approach to Scotland's economy, one in which trade unions are recognised, where your job values your worth as a citizen, where the bonus culture is replaced by more equitable salary differentials and support for equal pay. All of these criteria could and should become part of the Scottish Government's approach to procurement. Thank you.
Jackie Bailey, can I ask you to speak to Amendment 79 and the other amendments in the group?
Thank you very much, Convener, and can I also thank the committee for hosting so many MSPs here this morning. Can I speak very briefly to Amendment 79, which allows for equal pay audits to be considered as a criteria for awarding contracts. Now, members will know that equal pay audits consider pay gaps by gender, by ethnicity, by disability, and by working patterns. They are, to be quite honest, relatively easy to do. There's lots of support for businesses with toolkits and hands-on advice about how to conduct an equal pay audit and indeed what to do with the results. The benefits for business are very well documented already, whether it's improved productivity, improved staff retention, or whether it's improved performance. These are all positive benefits that arise. So by adopting this amendment, the committee and the Cabinet Secretary will encourage good practice amongst all contractors and make a very positive difference to enhancing equality in relation to pay. Can I also, like other colleagues, support the range of amendments before us? I recognise that these do come together to provide a very positive platform for economic change. It's right that we should do that using the power of public sector spending, which is quite considerable. I support Ken McIntosh's amendments, and can I also in particular support James Kelly's amendments in relation to the living wage, not least because he reminded us that 64% of those who earn less than the living wage currently are indeed women. So, Convener, I commend these amendments to the committee and to the Cabinet Secretary because, when taken together, I think they will make a real difference to economic equality for those employed in delivering public sector contracts. It is the case that we as a Parliament and across the public sector expect the very highest standards of delivery of public services. Who delivers that actually deserves to operate to the same high standards as you would find within the public sector. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you very much, and thank you for your brevity. Call Neil Bibby to speak to Amendment 80 and the other amendments in the group.
Thank you. Thank you, Convener. I welcome the opportunity to speak to Amendment 80. Childcare was a major feature in the recent passage of the Children and Young People Bill. Before that bill was even published and when it was being discussed, my Labour colleagues and I called for the Scottish Government to use the childcare powers it has now to help families and children. The reality is that even after that bill, Scotland lags behind the rest of the UK in the provision of childcare, and it's clear that the childcare issues of 2014 will not be solved by finally implementing this 7-year-old manifesto commitment. It's clear we have to do more, and the Procurement Reform Bill represents an ideal opportunity for the Scottish Government not just to talk the talk on childcare, but walk the walk. There has been a lot of discussion about extending preschool education hours by the Scottish Government in their White Paper on Children's Bill, but there's been next to no mention of action taken to improve out-of-school care for primary school-aged children and ensure employers provide greater access to childcare and flexible working. If we are to have a Scottish model of childcare which is affordable, high quality and crucially flexible and accessible, then it cannot be left to the public sector and essentially local authorities to do it alone. We need employers to make more of a contribution towards providing accessible childcare and flexible working. That's why my amendment would ensure that authorities could introduce a childcare requirement on any public contracts worth over £2 million. This would be two-pronged. In terms of accessible childcare, contracting authorities could ensure that contracts worth over £2 million which would presumably employ a considerable number of staff, provide a childcare facility or creche at the place of work. But in addition to that, to meet the needs of parents, it could insist on employees being able to work family-friendly working hours and help bring more mums and dads into the workplace, which I know is an ambition of the Scottish Government. I agree with the other amendments in this group. There are a number of areas where the procurement could be used to provide community benefits. The living wage, wage ratios, equal pay audits should all be included, and this bill could also include a childcare requirement. I understand the issue of using procurement to promote accessible childcare and flexible, family-friendly working is being proposed in this bill for the first time. But this issue is not new. An event was hosted recently by Marco Biaggi MSP on flexible family-friendly working in the Parliament recently, and there's good practice such as the Employers for Childcare group in Northern Ireland, which is encouraging family-friendly working there, and we should be looking to consider such practices here as well. I believe the idea is sensible and a reasonable one. I've recently spoken with a number of children's organisations who have indicated support for this proposal. Labour has put forward this idea in good faith. We are of course happy with it as it stands, but if the Scottish Government have problems with a childcare requirement as proposed, we will listen to suggestions from other parties and external organisations on any ways to improve childcare arrangements through procurement. But I would assume the Scottish Government has no objection to this proposal in principle. I hope the Scottish Government will and members of the committee will support this at stage 2. Failing that, I hope agreement could be reached for Labour's proposal for a childcare requirement at stage 3. Let's make a difference to childcare now using the powers we have.
Thank you. Does any other member wish to make any comments? Alex.
I'll try and keep my remarks brief. My remarks relate to the amendments in this grouping, but might equally be applied to a number of other groupings that will come along during the course of this process. The procurement bill, or the procurement reform bill as introduced, is a bill which appeals to me in that it sets out to create a fair and easy to understand level playing field in the area of public procurement. It has become obvious, however, that the bill also offers a number of opportunities where it could act as a proxy for a number of other political priorities. And many of the amendments that come forward today seek to have that effect. While I feel that it is important that the Parliament give the opportunity for many of these priorities to be aired and that we should take them into account in the longer term, I am not convinced that it is appropriate to allow this bill to be effectively hijacked in order to achieve these priorities. The reason why I am concerned about that is that while some of the speakers who have spoken to their amendments so far have said that they would like to see public procurement act as an example of best practice, the opposite effect may well be that by changing the bill in the way suggested, we end up creating a two-tier system of contracting in Scotland, where those that are regulated by the procurement reform bill operate to one standard, while other parts of the economy operate to another. So I'm concerned that if we go down the road of accepting these amendments and many of the other groupings which seek to use the bill as a proxy for other policies, that we may actually create a gulf in the Scottish economy that we would not wish to have the responsibility for closing.
Thank you. Can I just add, Mr Kelly, you said that the living wage was done in other areas. Perhaps you could explain where. And one of the things that came out during our consideration of the bill was the Deputy First Minister published, it was the European view on a sub-state imposing the living wage or implementing the living wage. Given that you and others said that the question was asked wrongly, I take it that in the meantime you have either yourself or got your MEPs to ask the question in a different form. Can you say whether you've done that, and if so, what was the reply?
You want me to sum up?
No, just maybe you could do that to answer those questions in your summing up.
I'll deal with those matters in the summing up.
Okay, Deputy First Minister.
Okay, thanks, Convener. There's a number of amendments in this group, and I want to go through all of them in turn. Let me start with amendments 36 and 39, which relate specifically to the living wage. The Government has already explained, and I think we have explained in some detail, why we are not able to make the living wage a mandatory requirement in the bill. And I'm not sure it's a good use of the committee's time to go through all of those arguments again in detail. Suffice to say, as the convener has just alluded to, we did seek advice from the European Commission. That was done by my predecessor in this job, Alec Neil. We've made available to the committee the letter that we received, and the position there is clear. We cannot make it a condition of a contract that a company pays a living wage that is higher than the minimum wage that is set in the UK, and that is a position that is the case under the Posted Workers Directive. But that advice is available and has been available for some time to committee members. I think the other point, though, to stress on the living wage, and I would hope it is a point that we can unite around, and I would address this particularly to Mr Kelly and his Labour colleagues. Our response to that Commission position was not to shrug our shoulders and say, well, there's nothing we can do through this bill on the living wage. We have absolutely not taken that position. We're very clear that we support the living wage. We support the principles of the living wage campaign. We've adopted the living wage for all of our own staff and all workers in the National Health Service. We've gone further on the living wage than any previous Scottish administration has done. We actively encourage others to adopt it. And we've thought very carefully and very deliberately in drafting this bill about what we can do, not just talked about what we can't do, but looked at what we can do within EU law in a procurement context. We take low pay as a government very seriously, and we're committed to doing everything we can to ensure that as many people as possible are benefiting from the living wage, because I wholeheartedly agree with James Kelly on the power of the living wage to transform people's living conditions. As I've said, we are leading by example by ensuring that all staff covered by our public sector pay policy are paid the living wage, and that is a policy that benefits thousands of public sector employees. We're firmly of the view that employers should reward their staff fairly. We have funded a pilot living wage accreditation scheme with the specific intention of increasing the number of employers paying the living wage in all sectors of the economy, and to encourage others to follow the example that we have set. And crucially, this bill provides for the government to develop statutory guidance for public bodies on the selection of bidders, which will cover, in particular, matters relating to recruitment, terms of engagement and remuneration of employees who will be involved in the contract. So, the intention is there, and we have very deliberately sought to use this bill to the maximum we can to progress and pursue our objective of expanding payment of the living wage. So while we can't support these amendments, I do hope there will be a reflection on the part of the committee that we are not doing nothing, that we are using this bill to the best of our ability to tackle this issue, albeit we're doing it in a different way to the method suggested by James Kelly. If I can turn to the other amendments, and just as a general comment, I actually have sympathy with the sentiments behind, I think, all of the other amendments that have been lodged here. And while I can't support any of them today in the form that they are in, I am happy to consider and continue consideration of these issues in advance of stage 3, and I'm happy to work with the members who have submitted these amendments to see if there is any common ground we can develop in the form of specific provisions in the bill, and certainly, notwithstanding where we get to on that, to consider all of these issues when it comes to the drafting of guidance that will underpin this bill. If I can turn to the specific ones, 69 and 70, which I think are both in Ken Macintosh's name. The bill, as Ken Macintosh is aware, and I think alluded to, the bill already provides for statutory guidance on how workforce-related matters should be taken into account in procurement procedures. Purchasers are already under a duty to consider how they can improve economic, social and environmental well-being. So it may well be that that duty could encompass what is proposed by the first of these amendments. And as I say, guidance will be published under section 24 on the selection of bidders, and to the extent that this is relevant, will address employment-related issues in connection with contracts. So I'm happy to give further consideration to whether there is anything we can do in the face of the bill, but also to make sure this is factored into our thinking in terms of the drafting of guidance. In relation to the second of Ken McIntosh's amendments, I wholeheartedly agree that effective employee representation and trade union recognition is an undoubted good thing. I don't think it's necessary to include it on the face of this bill, as Amendment 70 would do. There is already a clear regime in place under the Trade Union and Labour Relations Consolidation Act, which includes measures concerning the recognition of trade unions. And one of the things we've been very careful to consider through this bill is the interaction with other pieces of legislation. But as I say, I'm happy to have further discussion if that would be helpful on both of these issues. Turning to Amendment 79 in the name of Jackie Bailey. Again, I have got sympathy with this. Clearly, equal pay audits can bring benefits and clarity, not just to employees, but actually to employers as well. I'm not convinced, though, that limiting competition to companies who have conducted an equal pay audit would be consistent with our EU law obligations regarding equal treatment of suppliers. I've already pointed out that the bill provides for the issue of guidance and how workforce-related matters should be considered in procurement, and I'm happy to give a clear commitment today that we will consider this in the context of that guidance. Amendment 80 in the name of Neil Bibby. I'm glad Neil Bibby recognised the Government's commitment to childcare. Delivery of childcare, government-funded childcare, is already way in excess of the position we inherited from the last Liberal administration. So our commitment to continuing in a progressive way to expand childcare, I think, is well known and well understood. I'm not convinced that Amendment 80 would be appropriate for inclusion on the face of the bill. Contractual obligations of this nature can only be imposed in procurements where they are relevant and proportionate to the subject matter of the contract. Now, there might well be circumstances where an authority thinks that it's necessary and appropriate to impose conditions on contractors regarding their approach to childcare, and nothing in the bill will stop an authority applying such a clause if it considers it appropriate in the circumstances. But including a specific provision in the bill on the matter seems to me to be disproportionate, particularly given that it might not always be considered relevant to the subject matter of a particular contract. Lastly, I think 81 in Ken McIntosh's name, which relates to wage ratios. Can I say, first of all, I wholeheartedly endorse many of, if not all of, Ken McIntosh's comments about wage ratios. This comes down to whether, when we're awarding contracts, the general principles of EU law require us to treat companies equally and on their merits. And again, contractual obligations can only be imposed where they're relevant and proportionate to the actual subject matter of the contract. So I have reservations and doubts here about the amendment in its form and about including this on the face of the bill. But as I said, to start my comments on these amendments, I am happy, rather than close the door on any of these today, to continue discussions to see whether we can develop some common ground. I think Alec Johnson's point, bears repetition. I am in agreement with many of the comments that have been made around these specific issues today, whether it is good employment practices, trade union recognition, childcare, the payment of the living wage. We should be ambitious for what we do through procurement. This is public money and we should make sure we get best value for it. But we also have to be realistic about the extent to which we can solve all of these particular social issues purely through procurement without putting disproportionate burdens on public bodies that may have a counterproductive effect. So there are balances to be struck here, but in the interests of trying to build consensus, I would, in asking James Kelly to withdraw Amendment 39 and the others not to move their amendments, I do give an open assurance that I'm happy to continue discussion on these points, both in advance of Stage 3 and as we develop the guidance around these particular issues.
Okay, can I ask James Kelly to wind up and see whether he's pressing or withdrawing his amendment?
Okay, thank you, Convener. In terms of summing up, I'm disappointed by the Cabinet Secretary's response. I think in terms of the legal issues, it strikes me that the Government are rooted to a particular legal position and don't seem prepared to interact with alternative legal advice and other examples that are ongoing throughout the country. There is alternative legal advice in play, and that deals with some of the issues that the convener raised. And there are also practical examples throughout the country where councils like Renfrew, Islington, and even in London have introduced the living wage. I don't believe for a minute that Boris Johnson is more radical than Nicola Sturgeon, but I would urge Nicola Sturgeon, to find a way forward on this. The government have signalled via the White Paper that they're sympathetic to £400 million of corporation tax cuts. I think they've got to look to not only use this bill to send a strong signal to workers and to boost the economy, but to actually take the action that's required. And therefore I would urge the Cabinet Secretary between Stage 2 and Stage 3 to look at the alternative legal advice, look at other examples of how the living wage has been implemented throughout the country, and work with us on the appropriate amendments. In terms of Alec Johnson's point about this bill's been used to push people's particular political priorities, this is not about some kind of political posturing exercise. On all these amendments, on the living wage, on Ken McIntosh's amendments, on work sharing and wage ratios, on Jackie Bailey's point about equal pay, and Neil Bibby's on childcare, these would bring real benefits to the workplace. They would deliver real benefits for workers, and they would also result in a more harmonious relationship which employers would benefit from, and ultimately that would be to the betterment of the economy. We would have a stronger economy and a fairer economy, and that's not just some sort of posturing exercise. The point in being in politics is to make a difference, and that's what these suite of amendments are seeking to achieve. I think it's one thing to hear the warm words from the Cabinet Secretary, but we actually need action. We need the legislation to work and make a difference. I press the amendment and urge for support and all the other amendments in the group.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 36 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We move to a vote. Those in favour of Amendment 36, please show. Those against, please show. That amendment is not agreed. We now move to climate change duties, and I call Amendment 37 in the name of Claudia Beamish, grouped with Amendments 66, 40, 55, 59 and 60. Claudia Beamish, can I ask you to move Amendment 37 and speak to all amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener, and good morning to the Committee and Cabinet Secretary. The Procurement Reform Scotland Bill does provide a valuable opportunity to make the climate change duties in the procurement process robust and to clarify expectations. This is very important in view of our ever-increasing awareness of climate change, so much strongly underpinned by science. The extreme weather events over the Christmas break have focused the minds of many in Scotland on how they can make their contribution to slowing down climate change. It is my belief that many individuals of all ages, households, communities, public bodies and businesses have sometimes struggled to know how to make a difference. However, through evidence taken in my committee, Rural Affairs, Climate Change and Environment, I see an increasing understanding from those giving evidence on this issue that there is a culture change and a behaviour change whereby many believe that their contributions can and do make a collective difference. This is certainly the case in business and industry. Across my own region, South Scotland, I meet many in businesses who enthusiastically seek advice on how to lower their carbon footprint, and others who are already doing so. These companies highlight to me that it is a win-win situation as they are contributing to saving the planet while also driving down costs in a range of ways. Many actively involve their employees in this process. The procurement process is part of this commitment to tackling climate change, and my amendments seek to build on our world-leading Climate Change Act and relate back to it. I acknowledge there may be concerns from businesses about more bureaucracy and have tried to keep things as simple as possible. However, I am quite clear, and I hope the committee will agree with me, that we must move forward on this issue, and the procurement bill is this opportunity. The responsibility of contracting authorities is key in this process of greenhouse gas emissions duties, and my Amendment 37 identifies this. This is an opportunity for contracting authorities to be climate change leaders, in my view. And Amendment 40 adds a greenhouse gas emissions duty for contracting authorities. This puts the onus on the authority, and I quote, before carrying out a regulated procurement, to consider how, in conducting the procurement process, it can, and I would say on this, address the issue and make a positive impact. I do indeed think these commitments cut to the heart of the matter and take it forward in a proportionate and, I hope, reasonable way. Amendment 55, under the climate change duty requirements, puts a requirement on the contracting authority to, and I quote, include a climate change duty requirement in the contracting notice relating to the procurement. This would be the case with contract tenders over £2 million, and this chimes with the previous community benefit clause, which we will hear about later in the deliberations, with that threshold, and I believe it to be proportionate. There are a range of tools, some already adopted by the Scottish Government, which can be adopted in the assessment process for such a statement. And with large contracts, this commitment would make a significant difference to our carbon footprint. And I believe it is only right that in our collective quest to tackle climate change, this contribution is made through the procurement bill. In line with the arguments put forward for climate change duties, I am moving. I would also support Patrick Harvey's amendment in this group. In my view, these amendments are practical and deliverable to quote back the Cabinet Secretary's remarks at the beginning about how important this aspect is. And I ask for the committee's and the Cabinet Secretary's support for these amendments in the group. Thank you.
Could you just move the amendment, please?
Sorry.
Can you move Amendment 37?
Thank you. I move Amendment 37.
Thank you. Can I ask Patrick Harvey to speak to Amendment 66 and the other amendments in the group? Patrick.
Thank you very much, and good morning, Convener. To open, I wonder if I could first of all address the more general point that Alex Johnson made in the previous group about the issues which he perceives as seeking to hijack this bill, making it act as a proxy for other political priorities. That's the way Mr Johnson put it. I would invite the committee to reject that line of argument, first of all. This is about policy coherence. It seems to me that there's very little point in having public policy, priorities, legislative targets, statements of principle and intent from ministers if the way we spend very significant amounts of public money actually undermines those political priorities. This is about coherence between what we say and what we do. It may well be that Mr Johnson is right to say that the gap between high standards in the public sector and lower standards in the rest of the economy is a problem, and I invite him to abandon the deregulation obsession that some on the political right sometimes have. Let's ensure that the whole of our economy operates to high standards. I see Mr Johnson slightly amused by that one, so I'll move on. Nicola Sturgeon, as well, in responding to that point, said that it would be wrong to suggest that we can solve problems purely through procurement. Absolutely, and I don't suggest that we can. But I do ask the committee to ensure that we don't make these problems worse through procurement, through the way that we spend public money. Claudia Beamish and I have produced two variants on a theme, I think. There is one very important issue that they have in common, which is about the high standards that we're seeking. Claudia Beamish's amendment uses the phrase exercise functions in a way best calculated to reduce emissions. Mine uses the phrase act in the manner likely to best contribute to compliance with the existing climate change duties, guidance for which the government has already published. I took that view because there are existing duties, and I think, without exception, contracting organisations in this bill will be covered by those climate change duties. Now, those duties are set out, the guidance is there in detail, but it involves a degree of flexibility. Can I quote from paragraph 3.2 of the guidance? What is required in compliance with the duties may vary from one public body to the next, depending on various factors. It is therefore suggested that a degree of proportionality should be borne in mind. It's only one example of statements throughout the guidance which, read by an enthusiast, someone with a clear commitment to climate change, will give them permission to act with boldness. but read by someone who thinks this is way down their list of priorities, will also give permission for inaction. The common thread then between Claudia Beamish's amendment and mine about the scale of ambition, taking the action most likely to achieve this agreed public policy priority, is, I hope, understood by the committee. And whichever of these two options is more favoured, I hope the committee will vote for. My argument in favour of the Amendment 66 is purely that there are existing duties, and tying procurement to that seems a little neater to me. But in closing, Convener, can I also just make the one brief point in case the Cabinet Secretary decides to raise this? Clearly, since there are existing duties which, read properly, can apply to procurement, there's clearly not a legal barrier. There's clearly no legal barrier in terms of EU law involving climate change objectives in procurement. This is a question of intent, not legality. If it's possible, permissible to introduce climate change aspects to a procurement decision or a procurement strategy, surely it's a good idea to say that that should be the norm, and the highest standard of that issue being addressed should become the norm. And I look forward to the debate on these amendments, Convener. Thank you.
Hey, any other member wish to contribute? Okay, Deputy First Minister.
Right throughout the work we've done in this bill, we've been conscious of the need to keep the provisions of it as simple, straightforward and deliverable as possible, because in my view that is key to making sure that the bill does make a difference. And that has been particularly important in our considerations where the provisions of this bill might interact with requirements of other legislation. And it is important to stress the point that in this area of discussion, duties already exist under the 2009 Climate Change Act. During the development of the bill, we've also tried very hard to steer a course through what has been a very diverse, sometimes polar opposite range of opinions about what this bill should and shouldn't be doing. One view that was expressed strongly, particularly by local government stakeholders, was that existing legislation on climate change and the environment already establish significant duties in this area, and that the imposition of additional duties was not appropriate or necessary on the face of this bill. That said, as in the case of the living wage, it is not correct to say that nothing is being done through this bill. It is absolutely not the case. It would not be correct to say that. The bill specifically covers the environment through the general duty on sustainability. And that approach will leave public bodies with a degree of flexibility, which I think is an important degree of flexibility, which allows them to take a pragmatic approach and, in my view, a meaningful approach to dealing with environmental issues in their procurement activity. I'd also say that while it's the case that there is an absence of recognised or internationally adopted schemes to measure and record precise carbon footprints of particular goods, works or services, it's difficult, and it is difficult to see how purchasers would be able to take that specifically into account in terms of individual procurement exercises. In light of those comments, I'm not able to support Amendments 37, 40, 59 and 60 lodged by Claudia Beamish, although I would make the same comment as I made in the previous group. I am open to further discussions on these issues to see if there is ground we can develop in advance of stage 3 or in the suite of guidance that we will develop to underpin the bill. Turning to Patrick Harvey's amendments 66 and Claudia Beamish's amendment 55 on climate change, I've already outlined for the committee our general position on duties in the bill and the need to keep them as simple as possible, especially where there is existing legislation. As I've already said, the environment is specifically covered under the general sustainable procurement duty, and the bill already requires that authorities act with a view to securing improvements as they are required to do in line with that duties. In light of that, I think these amendments would add a layer of complexity that would not be justified and would be disproportionate for purchasers and for economic operators, because I believe through the existing duties that are there and the duty we are specifically imposing on this bill, what these amendments are seeking to achieve will be achieved in the way the bill is framed. So I would not support these amendments, but extend to both Claudia Beamish and Patrick Harvie, if they wish to take it up, an offer to have further discussions about how the guidance that we will develop can encapsulate some of the points that they have made this morning.
Okay, can I ask Claudia Beamish to wind up and say whether she's pressing or withdrawing her amendment?
Right, thank you, Convener. I've listened carefully to the Cabinet Secretary's remarks, which are indeed helpful. I've also listened to Patrick Harvie's remarks. I do believe at this stage, while I'm appreciative of the invitation to discuss the matter further, I do believe that at this stage it is important to move these amendments, because I don't believe that Patrick Harvie's Amendment 66 and my amendments in the group are mutually exclusive, and that between them they do offer a robust way forward that is not disproportionate. And in terms of the duties of guidance in the Climate Change Act and Patrick Harvie's amendment, I think it's important that those are referred to in this Act. And I also believe that, that in taking issues forward towards guidance, it's important to sharpen the commitment to lowering our carbon emissions within this procurement bill, and that this needs to be specific. So I do wish to move the amendments in my name.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 37 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a vote. Those in favour of Amendment 37, please show. Those against, please show. The amendment is not agreed to. We move on to general duties, priority of sustainable procurement duty. I call Amendment 61 in the name of Patrick Harvie, grouped with Amendments 62 and 73. Patrick, can I ask you to move Amendment 61 and speak to the other amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. Some similar themes, I think, in this group to the last. Amendments 61 and 62 simply swap the order of priority, I think I would describe it as, in section 8.3, which currently reads: a contracting authority must not do anything in pursuance of the sustainable procurement duty, which would conflict with its general duties under subsection 1. In effect, this means that we think sustainable procurement's a jolly good thing unless we can think of a reason not to do it. This is a question of priorities. If we believe it's not only desirable, but essential for the dignity and sustainability of our society, that we live within ecological limits, that we achieve the objectives of sustainability, then this is the way we have to begin living, not unless we can think of a reason not to do so. The general duties will continue to exist if my amendments in this group are agreed, but instead of the order of priorities being that way around, contracting authorities will have to not do anything in pursuance of the general duties which conflict with the sustainable procurement duty. It's a fairly simple change. The Amendment 73 adds a similar reference to the sustainable procurement duty under section 9 and is consequential on the first two amendments. I would simply urge the committee to consider what are the priorities that are being given to the general approach to sustainability in this bill. Is sustainability to be the norm? Are we to spend public money in a sustainable way unless there's an overriding barrier or something that makes that impossible? Or are we simply to continue with a situation where we'll see islands of excellence, examples of good practice scattered around the country, but generally speaking, individuals working in this area free very often with pressure of finances on them, invited to find excuses not to procure in a sustainable manner. I move Amendment 61, and I hope that the committee will be sympathetic.
Any other members wish to contribute? Deputy First Minister.
The general and sustainable procurement duties in the bill are framed specifically with a view to helping public bodies understand how the sustainable procurement duty should be interpreted and how it should be applied within the overarching framework of EU law that we operate in. Whether we like it or not, we are bound by the European law that pertains. The general duties state as a matter of domestic law the duties that already apply to some procurements below the existing EU law procurement threshold. They reflect duties that are derived from the EU treaty. Section 8(3) of the bill makes it clear for authorities that any action they take under the sustainable procurement duty has to be compatible with the EU duties that exist. In other words, compatible with the law that they are working within. If we reversed that position, which is the effect that Patrick Harvey's Amendments 61 and 62 would have, we would create a situation where the bill would seek to impose requirements on public bodies that might not be compatible with European law. And I would, politely take issue with Patrick Harvey's characterisation of the sustainable procurement duty. This bill, as drafted, emphatically does not say sustainable procurement is a good thing unless we can find ways of not doing it. What it says is that we should do things as long as they are within the law. In other words, as long as they don't break the law. And I would have thought that was a fairly obvious point for the committee to understand. In other words, as drafted, the bill helps public bodies understand their legal obligations. These amendments would have the opposite effect in that they would require public bodies to act in a way that wouldn't be consistent with EU legal obligations. And I don't think I have to spell out too much to the committee what the implications for public bodies would be in those circumstances. Amendment 73, also in this group, I think possibly arises out of a misreading of the bill. Amendment 73 seeks to add the sustainable procurement duty to the procurement strategy by adding Section 9 to the reference to Section 8. However, if you refer back to Section 8, you will see that it is Section 8 itself that imposes the sustainable procurement duty. So the reference in Section 11 is correct as it stands, and adding a reference to Section 9 would have no legal effect. So I hope that clarifies that matter. So while I don't question for a second Patrick Harvey's motivations here, I can totally understand what he's trying to do. I think the practical effect of these amendments would be such that we'd be putting our public bodies into the most impossible of situations, and I don't think any responsible Parliament should do that. And as I say, in relation to Amendment 73, I think when you read the bill, you will realise that this amendment is not necessary and wouldn't have the effect that it is intended to have.
Thank you. Can I ask Patrick Harvey to wind up and to press or withdraw his amendment?
Thank you. I think over the years of sitting at Scottish Parliament committees and moving amendments, the phrase from ministers, "I love what you've tried to do here," is about the clearest example of damning with faint praise. It's a very common argument that ministers will endorse the intent and say, "I very much appreciate what the member's intending to achieve, but this is not the way." The concern that I have is that kind of attitude is very often prevalent in many public bodies when they make procurement decisions. Even our own Scottish Parliament, when we, for example, decide how to spend money on travel for committees to go away elsewhere and take evidence or meet other organisations, at best, we might have a half-costed version of a sustainable travel option for committees to go somewhere else. And generally speaking, it's given very little attention. We're still spending public money in a way which has sustainability somewhere on the agenda, but it's quite a way down the list, and it very often tends not to be the actual outcome at the end of the day. So I understand why the Cabinet Secretary is concerned at the potential for a conflict with existing law. I hope that any minister in any government that shares a genuine commitment to making sustainability the norm, would challenge EU law or general practice throughout the public sector, rather than simply say that we have to go along with the flow. Now, I would like to press Amendment 61 at this stage, but if there is any willingness at all on the part of the government to look at an alternative way of achieving the same effect, then I'd be happy to discuss that prior to stage 3.
Okay, the question is that Amendment 61 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. Those in favour of Amendment 61, please show. Those against, please show. The amendment is not agreed to. I call Amendment 62 in the name of Patrick Harvey, already debated with Amendment 61. Patrick, to move or not move?
Not moved.
It's not moved. The question is then that Section 8 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. We move to Section 9, the extent of contracting authorities' duties and powers. Call Amendment 63 in the name of Patrick Harvey, grouped with Amendments 64, 76, 77 and 82. Patrick, can I ask you to move Amendment 63 and speak to all amendments in the group?
Well, I'm hoping this will be third time lucky, convener. I'll just leave now, shall I? The sustainable procurement duty, as it's currently set out in the bill, talks about considering how in conducting a procurement process a body can improve the economic, social and environmental well-being of the authority's area. It's quite a specifically geographic approach to sustainability, and it may well be that there will be benefits that flow within a local area from considering the social, economic and environmental well-being in that area. But I don't think it's a very holistic approach to the concept of sustainability. It does leave open the possibility that, for example, in procuring products that are produced overseas, the human rights impacts, the economic impacts, the environmental impacts of the production methods of those goods or services that are procured from other jurisdictions will simply be ignored. Even procuring waste services may have an economic, social or environmental impact, not just overseas, but in other parts of Scotland, outside the procuring authorities' the contracting authority's own area. I would hope that there's some willingness to look at a more holistic understanding of sustainability and of the global impacts, economic, social and environmental, of the procurement decisions that we make. And so my amendments would effectively change the form of words requiring consideration of how the procurement process can improve global economic, social and environmental well-being, rather than the impacts purely on the contracting authority's own area. The argument, I think, is that simple. It's a question of what sustainability means. Does it simply mean looking after one's own patch, or does it mean taking account of the economic, social and environmental impacts in a more holistic way? And I move Amendment 63.
Anyone else wish to contribute? Deputy First Minister.
I'll avoid saying anything nice about Patrick Harvey in this one in case he accuses me again of damning him with faint praise, so he can take my general sympathy for his sentiments as read rather than have me labour the point. I think it's important again here to emphasise the need for this legislation not just to be simple, but more importantly for it to be practically possible for it to be fully complied with. These amendments, as Patrick Harvey has just indicated, would require contracting authorities to consider global social, economic and environmental well-being rather than the well-being of their areas. The reason we focused the duty on the authority's area was that this is what it is most likely to be most familiar with and is most likely to be relevant in the context of a procurement exercise. The bill as it stands, though, does not prevent an authority from taking account of wider global or international issues if it wishes to do so and it thinks it's appropriate for it to do so. And I'm very happy to consider in discussion with Patrick Harvey, if he wants to, how we could use the statutory guidance that will underpin the sustainable procurement duty to encapsulate the perfectly legitimate points he's making about the wider implications of procurement exercises, particularly large procurements. But making the mandatory sustainable procurement duty applicable in relation to global well-being, I think would risk introducing a degree of complexity for purchasers that would simply not be manageable in a meaningful way at a practical level. And I think, while, as I said in a previous group, it is absolutely essential that we are ambitious in this legislation, this is legislation we're talking about here, and I think it is equally important that we take care that we don't impose mandatory duties that are so wide in their scope that they make the deliverability of them very difficult at a practical level. And I fear this amendment, if it was put on the face of the bill as part of a mandatory duty, could have that counterproductive effect. And I think it would be far better here to look at what we can do through guidance to make it very clear to purchasing authorities that they have considerations to take into account that go beyond their own physical geographical area, albeit that where they can make the biggest impact and where that they are able to deliver in a practical sense will be in the area that they exist in and the area that they serve. So I would ask Patrick Harvey to withdraw Amendment 63 and not move the other amendments in this group.
Can I ask Patrick Harvey to wind up and to decide whether he's pressing or withdrawing his amendment?
Well, I'm pleased that the Cabinet Secretary acknowledges the general argument that sustainability considerations will involve recognition of impacts beyond a contracting authority's own geographic area. And if, for some reason, the committee is more persuaded by Nicola Sturgeon's arguments than by mine in these amendments, then I'll happily have that discussion with the government in relation to guidance when the time comes. I would like to challenge, though, the Cabinet Secretary's argument that this introduces a degree of complexity which risks being undeliverable. If a contracting authority procures, I don't know, let's say a wagon load of widgets, whatever it is, which are produced, which are manufactured in their own area, then it will have to consider all of the impacts of production processes, of economic justice, of environmental impacts in that area. If the widgets are being manufactured in the neighbouring area, the job is no more complex. The job is no more complex to consider the very same impacts. Now, if it's produced on the other side of the world, it may be a more complex job to do, but I still don't think it should be ignored. And I would remind the committee that the requirement is only that before carrying out the procurement, the contracting authority should consider how, in conducting the process, it can improve the social, economic and environmental well-being. So this is simply about putting these global aspects onto the agenda for consideration. It's not about pretending that everybody can answer every question or achieve 100% certainty where there are areas of doubt. But certainly if impacts are being had in a neighbouring area, it's no more complex, no more difficult to deliver that objective than if they're produced in the contracting authority's own area. I do want to press Amendment 63, but if the committee is not convinced, then I hope there'll be further consideration of this when it comes to the guidance.
The question is that Amendment 63 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. Those in favour of Amendment 63, please show. Those against? That amendment is not agreed to. I call Amendment 64 in the name of Patrick Harvey. I already debated with Amendment 63. Patrick, to move or not move?
Sorry, this is 64?
64, sorry.
Not moved.
Not moved. Okay. Right, we're coming up against the time allotted for here, but I'm...
That's the question.
Oh.
That's the question to ask. Oh,
no, it didn't move to me. So we move on to sustainable procurement duty. I call Amendment 65 in the name of Mary Fee, grouped with Amendments 2, 67, 71, 3, 72, 8, 42 and 52. Can I ask Mary to move Amendment 65 and speak to all the amendments in the group as concisely as possible?
Thank you, Convener, and I will be as brief as I possibly can. Throughout the evidence sessions, we've heard that the procurement bill has been labelled as an enabling bill, and my amendments will provide strength and clarity to the bill, meaning that the bill will enable contracting authorities, procurers and communities to get the greatest benefits possible. And I must stress that none of the amendments that are in my name will detract from the overall purpose of procurement reform. Amendment 65 in my name is a simple and straightforward amendment which will provide extra clarity. And the reasoning behind the amendment is to place a focus on people that live and work in an area. The bill as it stands is too ambiguous, and we need to ensure that maximum benefit is derived for everyone through procurement. Amendment 42 in my name has been drafted to strengthen and simplify the process for contracting authorities to involve only certain businesses, and it would place a duty on the Minister to publish guidance that such contracting authorities would have to abide by, and mirrors the amendments 10A, 11A and 12A. And this would further increase the participation of micro, small and medium-sized businesses, as well as supported businesses and the third sector. I also support Amendment 2 in the name of James Kelly on cooperative societies, Amendment 71 in the name of Patrick Harvey, Amendment 3 in the name of James Kelly, Amendment 72 in the name of Jackie Bailey, Amendment 8 in the name of the Cabinet Secretary, and also Amendment 52 in the name of Sarah Boyack. All those amendments will strengthen the ability through procurement to make communities more sustainable and to provide greater benefits. I cannot, however, support Amendment 67 in the name of Patrick Harvey. I struggle to understand how we would be able to comply with the amendment and what benefit the amendment would bring. So, in winding up, Convener, can I move Amendment 65 in my name?
Can I ask James Kelly to speak to Amendment 2 and the other amendments in the group?
Okay, I formally move Amendments 2 and 3 in my name in relation to recognition of co-ops and in relation to this section. Quite rightly, the Sustainable Procurement Duty section references SMEs and third sector organisations in relation to improving the economic, social and environmental well-being of the, as it defines in the bill, the authorities area, and essentially local communities. I think co-ops play an important role throughout the country and in local communities in supporting local workers and also reinforcing a community spirit. And therefore, I think it would strengthen the bill if co-ops were included in this section so that we can ensure that the benefit, the economic benefit of procurement in the bill is spread evenly throughout the country and uses all the assets at our disposal, including cooperatives.
Thank you. Can I ask Patrick Harvey to speak to Amendment 67 and the other amendments in the group?
Thank you, Convener. Again, in seeking to tweak the sustainable procurement duty, I hope that there's some general agreement with the principle that human rights need to be seen in the context of sustainability. At the moment, as I mentioned in the last group, the economic, social and environmental well-being is the various categories of impacts that are expected to be considered. Now, there will be many situations in which social well-being will be understood to have a connection to human rights, and that some people might argue that it's fully covered. I hope that simply paying due regard to the UN's principles on business and human rights would seek to merely give some greater emphasis to that aspect, and to underline that sustainability is at root about people rather than simply about an ecosystem understood separately from the way people live within it. Amendment 71 tries to strengthen the language in a similar way to the climate change amendments that we discussed earlier. Uses the phrase "in the way best calculated" to replace the phrase "with a view to securing such improvements." This is simply about expecting that we seek the highest standard rather than something of a standard, which I think is a little vague.
Thank you. Jackie Bailey, can I ask you to speak to Amendment 72 and the other amendments?
Thank you very much, Convener. And Amendment 72, you'll be pleased to hear, is very straightforward. And in order to curry favour with you and the committee, I will be brief and only speak to this amendment. Mary Free quite rightly said that this section deals with the sustainable procurement duty, and I am simply seeking to expand that definition of well-being to make it, if you like, slightly less woolly, with a specific reference to inequality. I think ensuring well-being of all our communities is an ambition that's shared across the Parliament, but it can be very wide in its interpretation. What do we actually mean by this? It can be subject to variation in application, and I think we need to be sure, when we are talking about substantial sums of public money, that we secure the best possible value for that and we prioritise what matters. So having that very clear, sharp, defined focus on reducing inequality, I think, is helpful in guiding the public sector when awarding contracts to think about the gains that should be a priority for their local areas. I do believe, Convener, if we share an ambition of a more equal Scotland, which I think we do, we should be using the considerable public sector spending to try and deliver that, as well as delivering the right framework for contracts to be awarded in, and in that way we deliver on equality objectives. And I go back to an earlier point I made. The provision of public sector services is one that we regard as being world-class and of the highest quality. If others deliver for us, then surely we would be seeking that they operate to those self-same standards, and for that reason I would be supporting Amendment 72 and the majority of others in the group, with the exception, I'm afraid, Patrick, of yours.
Thank you. Can I ask the Deputy First Minister to speak to Amendment 8 and the other amendments in the group?
Thanks. The sustainable procurement duty is an important element of this bill. In fact, it's one of the most important elements of the bill. It requires public bodies to think carefully about how the procurement process can make real improvements to an authority's area, and also it's designed to enable SMEs, supported businesses, third sector organisations to access contract opportunities. It is, in short, about making sure we are using public sector spend in its totality to make a difference to communities and to the business environment of the country. Like every other section of the bill, though, we've got to ensure that it's consistent with European law, that it's reasonably simple to apply, and that it doesn't impose unnecessary or disproportionate burdens on public bodies. If I can deal firstly with Amendments 8 and 42. Amendment 8 is the one in my name. Having considered the various points that were raised during Stage 1 and raised in the Committee Stage 1 report regarding the sustainable procurement duty, I have decided that it would be appropriate to take a power to issue statutory guidance on the matter. That's why I've lodged Amendment 8. Mary Fee obviously was thinking along similar lines in relation to Amendment 42. I would point out, though, that Amendment 42 would limit guidance to the part of the sustainable procurement duty that relates to SMEs, third sector organisations and supported businesses only. It wouldn't create the obligation to bring forward guidance in relation to the other parts of the sustainable procurement duty. Amendment 8 relates to all aspects of the sustainable procurement duty and will therefore, I believe, meet the aim of Amendment 42 in a more general way, and I would therefore ask Mary Fee to reflect on that and perhaps support Amendment 8 and not move Amendment 42 when we get to that point. Turning now to the other amendments in the group, Amendments 65 and 72 both relate to considerations of well-being in the sustainable procurement duty. Mary Fee's Amendment 65 as a requirement to consider the well-being of individuals in an authority's area, while Jackie Bailey's Amendment 72 seeks to define well-being as including the reduction of inequality. Reducing inequality and improving the well-being of individuals, to me, are clearly part of the authority's general duty in promoting the well-being of its area. However, I actually believe that the duty itself is best framed in general terms rather than attempting to highlight certain particular aspects of it, because I think if you start to single out particular aspects, the danger is you then overlook another equally important aspect of sustainability. So I actually take the opposite view to Jackie Baillie. I think the duty on the face of the bill is best expressed in general terms, and that we then use guidance to further define it and give further detailed guidance to procuring authorities about the particular aspects that they would require to take into account to meet that general duty that's expressed on the bill. And I'm certainly happy to give the undertaking, which would be our intention anyway, that guidance will be used to ensure that authorities understand the different aspects of that general duty of sustainability. Amendments 2 and 3 lodged by James Kelly would require contracting authorities to consider how to facilitate the involvement of cooperative societies in procurements. Again, something that I would welcome. I don't think these amendments are necessary. The sustainable procurement duty already includes references to the third sector, and the third sector includes cooperative societies. And if it's felt necessary or helpful, that's a point I'm more than happy that the guidance makes explicitly clear. But I don't think it is appropriate or necessary to put on the face of the bill reference to a particular subset of the third sector, given that the reference to the third sector would encompass co-ops. Amendment 67 on the UN's guiding principles. The bill already provides a mechanism for dealing with companies that don't meet appropriate standards. Also, contracting authorities already have to comply with a range of requirements derived from EU law on equal treatment and from national equality legislation, in addition to being subject to obligations under the Human Rights Act 1998. Imposing an across-the-board duty on purchasers in relation to UN guidance on human rights would, in my view, be disproportionate, and for those reasons I don't support this amendment. I think Amendment 71, also in Patrick Harvey's name and the original drafting of Section 9, subsection 1, share a common aim to ensure that authorities act in accordance with the sustainability duty. The original draft, though, provides important flexibility for an authority to judge what is lawful and appropriate in the context of an individual procurement and therefore act accordingly. That flexibility is important, and I don't think we can underestimate how important it is in ensuring that compliance with the sustainable procurement duty doesn't create conflict with European law. And to go back to an earlier discussion, that is not about saying we want to make it easy for authorities to get out of the sustainable procurement duty. It is simply stating the obvious fact that authorities must act within the confines of the law. And that was a particular tension that the Stage 1 report particularly recognised. In this respect, EU law requires authorities to take into account considerations only if they are relevant and proportionate in any given case. The proposed amendment would remove the ability of the authority to identify and consider what it could do in a particular procurement, and it would impose obligations to act in ways that might not be relevant and proportionate in each case. So retaining the degree of flexibility is important in ensuring that public bodies don't come to regard the duties as something that is impractical, that should only be paid lip service to, which is absolutely not what the intention of this bill is. Finally, on Amendment 52 from Sarah Boyack, again, I want to stress that keeping the burden on public bodies proportionate is important here. Making it a mandatory requirement across the board that public bodies must state how the contract will contribute to the sustainable procurement duty, I think would be disproportionate. I am, however, willing to address this issue through guidance, and that is something I'd be happy to keep the committee informed on as the guidance develops. The annual reports will also address this issue because they'll include a statement of how regulated procurement has contributed to the authority's procurement strategy. So, in conclusion, I would ask that Mary Fee withdraw Amendment 65 and, in light of the more general nature of Amendment 8, not move Amendment 42, and that the other amendments don't move their particular amendments in this group.
And finally, Sarah Boyack, can I ask you to speak to Amendment 52 and the other amendments?
Thank you very much, Convener. I'm just listening to what the Cabinet Secretary was saying there. I think the purpose in this is ensuring that when contracts are actually awarded, there is a degree of transparency as to what they will achieve. And the amendment I'm suggesting would be to add in at section 18 a requirement that when awards are publicised, the contracting authority must include a statement setting out how the contract would contribute to the achievement of the matters mentioned in section 9.1. And the purpose of doing this is really all about transparency. Quite a few people have said to me, will this bill make a real difference? And one of the things that this would do would be to enable the benefits from awarding a contract to be actually made explicit. Now, this amendment came from discussions with SCVO, who were very keen to see not just the objectives of procurement stated in the bill, but that actually to be followed through, so that when contracting authorities are making decisions and they're awarding contracts, they are actually able to explain explicitly how they are actually achieving the requirements of the bill. And it's one of the ways of avoiding sustainability issues being sidestepped. And it does help reinforce some of the points that Jackie Bailey was making about our social objectives that are set out as requirements of the bill, but it just actually means it's actually achieved. So it's really about making sure, I think, that there's greater transparency on how sustainable procurement is being delivered on a case-by-case basis. I take the point the Cabinet Secretary makes about an annual report. That will help. But this would just, I think, help concentrate the mind when each and every procurement decision is actually being made by procurement officers, that there will be a reporting process and that they will be held to account in doing that. I don't think it's disproportionate. I think it would be a relatively straightforward thing to do, and I think it helps answer that question of what difference does this bill make when all these decisions are actually being made in practice. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to speak? Okay, can I ask Mary Fee to wind up and to decide whether you're pressing or withdrawing your amendment?
Thank you, Convener. And can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for her remarks. And it does appear from the remarks that have been made that we both share the same aim about getting maximum benefit for individuals and communities. Unfortunately, it would seem that we differ slightly in the way that we can achieve this. And I do feel that we need to be more specific and more precise in the bill to ensure that the maximum benefit is derived for communities and individuals. And for that reason, I will be pressing Amendment 65. I am heartened to hear that the Cabinet Secretary has assured that she will publish statutory guidance. And in reflecting on that, I will not be pressing Amendment 42.
Okay, the question is then that Amendment 65 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. There will be a vote. Those in favour of Amendment 65, please show. Those against, please show. The amendment 65 is not agreed to. I call Amendment 2 in the name of James Kelly, already debated with Amendment 65. Mr Kelly, to move or not move?
Move.
The question is that Amendment 2 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
No.
We're not agreed. There will be a division. Those in favour of Amendment 2, please show. Those against, please show. The amendment is not agreed to. And that's as far as I think we'll go to today. We'll pick up next week where we've left off today. And the deadline for lodging any amendments to the remaining section of the bill is 12 noon on Friday, the 14th of March. And can I briefly suspend the meeting to allow witnesses to leave the room and for the next panel to take their seats. Thank you. Next item in the committee's final evidence is the committee's final evidence session on the Housing Scotland Bill, and today we hear from the Minister of Housing and Welfare and her supporting officials. So can I welcome Margaret Burgess, Minister for Housing and Welfare, William Fleming, Head of Housing Services Policy Unit, Barry Stalker, Principal Policy Officer, Private Rented Housing, Daniel Coldridge, Senior Policy Officer, Private Housing Services Team, and Colin Brown, Senior Principal Legal Officer from the Scottish Government. I also welcome Patrick Harvey, who has stayed with us for this session, and I invite the Minister to make any opening remarks.
Okay, thank you, Convener. I'm pleased to be here to answer questions about the Housing Bill. As you know, it's a wide-ranging bill with provisions affecting all types of housing. Its policy objectives are to safeguard the interests of consumers, support improved quality and achieve better outcomes for communities. I commend the committee for taking extensive evidence from such a wide range of stakeholders. And I've been following the evidence sessions closely, and I welcome the broad support from stakeholders for the bill's objectives and for many of the policy principles in the bill. On the private rented sector, there is clear support for measures to improve quality and access to justice through regulating letting agents, strengthening local authority powers to tackle poor conditions, and introduce a private rented sector tribunal. There is consensus on ending the right to buy, although I'm aware that less consensus about how long the notice period should be before that right is ended. It's clear too that views on changes to social housing allocations and tools available to landlords to tackle antisocial behaviour are mixed. I want to reflect on the range of views on the bill and consider these along with Stage 1 report before reaching decisions about ways in which provisions in the bill could be strengthened. However, I want to make you aware of an issue that I'm minded to explore further, which has been set out in written evidence by the Glasgow West of Scotland Forum of Housing Associations. The Forum argues that a housing association that is considering joining another housing association to form a group structure should have to ballot the tenants before it can do so. So officials will be writing to interested stakeholders today, inviting their views on this proposal, and I will consider those along with any views that the committee might have on this issue. Many of the stakeholders have acknowledged the extensive consultation that went ahead of the bill being introduced, and I will continue that dialogue when I meet with my Housing Policy Advisory Group later this month to discuss the bill. And I look forward to receiving your Stage 1 report. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Adam, would you like to start the questioning, please?
Thanks, Convener, and good morning, Minister. A couple of general questions just to start off with. Could I ask firstly, how will the provisions in the bill meet the NPF national outcomes listed in the policy memorandum, and those were well-designed, sustainable places, strong, resilient and supportive communities, public services responsive to local people's needs?
Well, I think, as I said earlier, the majority of stakeholders have acknowledged that the provisions in the bill will support the objectives that we've laid out, set out in the policy memorandum. I think introducing the right to buy, measures for social landlords in terms of being flexibility in the allocation of their stock and to tackle anti-social behaviour will ensure and support strong, resilient communities. So I think that meets, I think, national outcome 11, I'm told. Introducing the private rented sector tribunal and giving local authorities more discretionary powers to tackle disrepair are aimed at improving quality. And again, I think that contributes to living in a well-designed, sustainable place. Regulating the letting agents and modernising mobile home sites aim to improve quality and levels of service and professionalism, and I think that would tie in with the national outcomes as well.
Thank you very much for that response. In terms of the consultation on the bill, we've had quite a lot of feedback to the effect that it was very well received by a lot of the witnesses giving evidence to us. but we've heard some comment to suggest that young people could perhaps have been more involved in the consultation process. Can you give us reassurance that the equality impact assessments for the bill have been fully comprehensive?
I think they were fully comprehensive, and we tackled early on, recognised early on that young people had to be consulted, and it was looked at in the areas of social housing and in the private rented sector. The regulation of letting agents would have an impact on young people. It was also recognised by officials that we couldn't consult young people in the normal ways, that we had to look at other ways of consulting young people, and we used youth groups and organisations to do that, to set up discussion forums, and we also used the social media. The response might not have been as great as we had anticipated, but I think there was a recognition that we had to look at other ways of tackling, of consulting young people, and that their views were important. So we well recognised that and made every effort to consult with young people, and did in fact get responses from those that attended the discussion forums.
Thank you very much for that, Minister.
Okay, anybody else on the general bits? Okay, if we move on to right to buy, Alex, you're going to start on this.
You convener. I'm sure it's no surprise to the Minister that right to buy is one of the interesting areas for me. Could the Minister explain what the Government's motivation was in moving at this time to end right to buy?
I think there were a number of things. I think one was to protect the social housing stock, which we've lost over 450,000 houses from social rent since right to buy was introduced. Right to buy has been changed and amended over the period, and it becomes now that it's in its current format, it's very complex. There's different areas of right to buy, depending on length of tenancy, depending where someone lives, depending on the type of house, and it was becoming even difficult for people to understand. And I think ending right to buy puts everyone in the same position. We also now we have a number of other government schemes to encourage people and to assist people onto the housing market that want to get onto the housing market. We have our LIFT schemes, our My New Home mortgage indemnity guarantee scheme. So we have other schemes in place to help and encourage people onto right to buy, and we felt this was the right time to take this step.
The statistical evidence indicates that right to buy was withering on the vine anyway, and the number of houses that were actually being sold to their tenants had dropped to under 1,000 a year. In addition to that, of course, the assumption I think can be made that of that 1,000 tenants a year who were choosing to take up their right, if they're denied that right, very few of them are actually going to vacate the property. So it doesn't actually save many properties for to be re-let, does it?
Well, it keeps those properties in the social rented sector. The properties remain there. The rental income is there for the landlords to use, which helps spread if houses are sold at huge discounts, the asset base of the landlord diminishes as well. So we think it was the right step to take. In the consultation, there's huge support in the consultation for ending the right to buy, and you know, we do believe it is the right step to take.
Has the government made an assessment of the impact on demand to right to buy of actually setting a date for its ending? Is there a serious danger here that by moving to end right to buy, we may actually give it a sudden and explosive lease of life at the end of its process?
No, that was something that we certainly considered. We did look at that, whether or not there would be a kind of spike if we announced the right to buy. The most recent figures show there has been an increase, but we anticipated that after the announcement. But in terms of the last quarter, I think it was 101, if I'm correct, 101 houses have been sold. Increase in house sales under right to buy in the last quarter. So we don't think that will continue. We also know that there's going to be stricter regulation in mortgage lending for people to make it absolutely clear of the affordability in terms of right to buy, so that people know what they're entering into. Likewise, with the Scottish Government, we're very clear in the guidance that we give tenants that people realise that right to buy and buying a house has got disadvantages as well as advantages for consumers, and we're very clear in that. So we still think we will save the 15,500 homes over the period under this piece of legislation, if we enforce this legislation.
You don't think we're going to see a rush of sons and daughters rushing to buy their parents' houses, as we've seen occasionally in the past, or teams of young men going down streets, knocking on doors, offering to lend money for people to buy their council houses?
I don't think we will see that, but what I would say is, repeat what I said about the stringent mortgage regulations that are coming in to ensure that people, when they are borrowing to buy a house, can actually afford the house, and that's the mortgage market review, I think it's called. So no, we don't anticipate that. We didn't have evidence during the consultation that that would happen, and we don't anticipate that.
When we spoke to officials at the start of this process, we talked about the 3-year period that had been proposed to end right to buy. And we've spoken to a number of witnesses who have talked about shortening that period. Does the Minister have a view at this time about the period which will be allowed at the end of the right to buy and whether that can be changed?
I think what I said in my opening statement, that is something that I will consider when I get the Stage 1 report and looking at the evidence. I did allude to that in the evidence, that there has been, there was not agreement that the 3 years was the right period. So we certainly am looking at it, but we've got to balance the right to protect the housing stock against the right of the tenants to be able to take up their right to buy, and under ECHR. I don't know if, Colin, you want to add any more to that?
People currently who have a right to buy have something that would be recognised as a right in ECHR terms, so any interference with that has to be proportionate, and that is a balance, as the Minister's just said. It's the justification for the interference with the right, as against giving people an appropriate period of time to consider whether they want themselves to exercise the rights they currently have before they lose them. That's not purely an ECHR point. There are wider issues around people considering what is appropriate for their circumstances and having an opportunity to take proper advice on that. The 3-year period was not selected because that was felt to be a minimum period that would ensure ECHR compliance. It was selected because it was felt to be a right period. And again, as the Minister has said, there would have to be an assessment of any alternative proposals.
Thank you very much.
Okay, if we move on to part 2, which is social housing, Mark.
Thank you, Convener. Just Section 3 of the bill proposes that a reasonable preference, an allocation given to people who are homeless or living in unsatisfactory conditions, and in both cases have unmet housing needs. Minister, are you able to explain what is meant by unmet housing needs and how that will be assessed?
The assessment will be clearly to the landlords to assess housing need in line with their framework and how they, as amended by the bill, and with any guidance that we publish. So the assessment on any housing need or any reasonable preference is for the landlord. But what we're trying to do in the bill is be flexible, more flexibility, and focus on the need for housing, which can be a number of things: people living in poor housing conditions, people that have overcrowded housing, people who need to be rehoused because of a harassment or a medical condition. So it's about having that need for a home, and one of the other preferences that apply to it, which is the unsatisfactory conditions, or for the reasonable preference, sorry. So really that's what we're looking at. It's about flexibility and focusing on need as opposed to anything else in terms of allocating houses. It's the need that's important.
Yeah, and you specifically mentioned housing which were below a tolerable standard, and the government statistics have shown that there are still up to 15,000 houses in the socially rented sector which fall below that tolerable standard. Just to ask specifically why the requirement for giving reasonable preference for the families living in those 15,000 has been removed.
Well, it hasn't been removed as such because they will come under unsatisfactory housing conditions. So people who are currently, it was to widen that as well, people who are currently what's called, it's only 2.5%, I think, under a below tolerable standard. What we're looking at is unsatisfactory housing conditions, and all of these people would, that you talk about in the below tolerable standards, would still have a housing need under unsatisfactory housing conditions.
Okay, I'll just move on to a separate point. A number of witnesses have raised concerns about the possibility of age discrimination in the allocation policy, and they have stated that it could be used in a discriminatory way, and that allocation should be made on the basis of need and circumstance. Just asked how you would respond to those concerns and how you monitor use of that provision to make sure that younger people aren't being discriminated against.
I think the first thing I would say is that there's absolutely no intention that anybody is discriminated against, and all landlords and cannot use discriminatory practices in terms of allocating houses. So I think that's absolutely clear. Need, back to what I said, need is the absolute priority. This was about flexibility to allow landlords that came up during the consultation to make better use and sometimes better sense of how they allocate houses when you have need. Age should never take precedence over need. That's the first thing I would say. But when you have several people with a housing need, a similar housing need, and an example might be where you had a block of 4 flats or four houses, and the downstairs one, the young people in the premises, and one of the downstairs flats became empty. And it had to be allocated, and you had an older person on the housing list and a younger person on the housing list, and in those circumstances the council could, or the landlord could determine it would be more appropriate to put the young person in there when it's other young people, rather than put an older person into the building with young people, or it could work conversely. So it's about being more flexible and better use of the allocation. It's certainly not intended in any way to be discriminatory. When the housing regulator, part of the charter is that houses must be equal, there has to be proper access to housing for everyone. We're very clear even in the bill that aged 16 and 17-year-olds should not be discriminated against in age. So there is no intention whatsoever that this is about discriminating against young people or any other age group. It is about making good and sensible and appropriate use of the housing where you have people, several people with a similar need or with a need for housing, an unmet need, meet the reasonable preferences, and when a house has been allocated, a landlord can look at that and say, well, is this sensible? And we've all heard from people who maybe moved in beside a group of young people, or vice versa, where it causes problems. So it's about making sensible use of the housing stock.
Okay, Mary, you've got some questions on antisocial behaviour.
Yes, thank you, Convener. Part 2 of the bill contains provisions that are aimed at giving social landlords more tools to tackle antisocial behaviour, including the ability to grant or convert existing SSTs to short SSTs. And the committee recently, as part of our evidence, we heard from local tenants groups in Dumbarton about the very real antisocial behaviour problems that they face. And what evidence is there that the proposed tools in the bill will help landlords tackle antisocial behaviour?
Okay. During the consultation process, landlords, CIH, ALACHO and SFHA welcomed the proposals for tackling antisocial behaviour. We also recognise, as they said, it's not going to be the absolute panacea, it's not going to be the absolute, it's going to sort, and we're not even suggesting that this bill will bring an end to antisocial behaviour. We'll sort it, but it gives landlords key tools to use to tackle antisocial behaviour for the very points that you made there, hearing it from experiences of tenants. We've all heard the difficulties for tenants living with antisocial neighbours, and likewise we know that landlords have often faced difficulties in trying to remove tenants that have been antisocial. So it is about giving them tools to be able to do that and be able to tackle it quicker. And in some cases with where we have the criminal conviction one, where it's gone through without having to take it through another process as well, when clearly the behaviour is not acceptable for a community. And this is about getting better outcomes for communities.
Thank you. COSLA have suggested that we need to think about more innovative ways to tackle antisocial behaviour. And likewise, the Tenant Information Service suggested that partnership working is a critical way of dealing with antisocial behaviour. And we have heard other evidence around the same theme, but the bill doesn't directly address these issues. So how will the bill's provisions regarding antisocial behaviour help to provide better outcomes for communities?
To what I said earlier, I think it will provide a better outcome for communities in giving landlords more tools to do it. The measures on antisocial behaviour in the bill are intended to help landlords play their part by giving them the tools to act in circumstances where at the moment they're unable to do so, and that should contribute towards better communities. But partnership working, I think we all agree, antisocial behaviour is not going to be resolved by just one section. A lot of the antisocial behaviour is other agencies that are dealing with it, whether it be the police and other agents that are working with antisocial behaviour. But I would say that that's not, to put that in the face of the bill, I don't think would give any better results than what you're looking for. It's clear in the Housing Charter as well that landlords must work in tackling antisocial behaviour with other agencies, and there's no evidence that they're not working with the other agencies in doing that. We've had no evidence presented to us that's saying that when there's an antisocial behaviour issue that it's agencies are not working together. They are working together, and we are giving landlords an additional tool to play their part in it, and I think that's what we're trying to do in the Housing Bill.
I suppose there is evidence that partnership working can be quite patchy across the country. Some areas are far better at it than others. And do you not think there could have been a need to put something in the bill to kind of strengthen and shore up that necessity to work in partnership?
There was, during our consultation, that didn't come out, unless I'm wrong, unless one did want to look at no.
We've not really had any evidence that this was an area that we ought to be legislating for. I think the evidence was that we should be doing more to give landlords the right sort of tools so that they could play their part within a partnership. So I think there's a presumption that partnership working is there. Maybe it may not be as good everywhere as it might be, but I think there's a presumption that there always is partnership working, and that what we're doing in the bill is focusing on the landlord role, what the landlord can do. And so the bill doesn't address the wider issue, it does focus on the role of the landlord, and by giving them more tools, we hope that they can therefore be more effective partners with police and local authorities.
Okay, thank you. We also heard evidence to suggest that the removal of the test of reasonableness in certain eviction cases, as set out in section 15 of the bill, is a fundamental erosion of tenants' rights. And could you explain to me how you think the proposals in section 15 achieve an appropriate balance between the rights of the landlord and the rights of the tenant?
The proposal in section, in terms of the reasonableness test, is this is in serious cases where someone has been convicted of an offence that has caused distress in their community and to their neighbours. There has to be that bit. It's not just about committing offence inside their own house. It doesn't impact on anyone else. This is a serious offence that has impacted on the rest of the community, and someone has been convicted of that. And it's in those circumstances we're saying if the landlord is running one case perhaps in terms of the antisocial behaviour aspect and then has to run a separate case to go through an eviction process, redoing things which is taking up time, and that's the complaint always in antisocial behaviour cases, the time it takes for a landlord to be actually able to evict somebody in these serious cases. So that's the kind of circumstance we're talking about it happening in. But in terms of tenants, it's not mandatory. It hasn't, I mean, landlords are not just you just have to evict somebody because they have been convicted. That is not the case, and that's not the intention. And there's a 12-month period in there where they've got 12 months to do it, and that gives the tenant an opportunity to change their behaviour, amend their behaviour, and in those circumstances the landlord would not necessarily proceed with an eviction case. Also, the tenant will always have the right to challenge it in court as well if they feel that they have been unreasonably or unfairly treated. So this is about serious cases where someone has been convicted of behaviour that has adversely impacted on their community and in their, you know, their neighbourhood, and it's in those circumstances. But I think we've built in that provision to allow that the tenant to change their behaviour. I think that's important. I mean, all through it, and there's all the built-in support as well that we have, because for someone to be convicted for the antisocial behaviour, then there has been a lot going on. It's not just something that happens and it's automatic. There's been a lot of work done to get that case to court and to have that tenant evicted, you know, charged and convicted.
Thank you for that. Can I just finally ask you about probationary tenancies? Because the government consulted on the possibility of introducing initial probationary tenancies for all new tenants, and it's not been taken forward in the bill. And we've heard a mix of evidence. Some supported initial tenancies, some didn't support initial tenancies. So can I ask you why the proposal for initial probationary tenancies is not being taken forward, given that 62% of respondents to the consultation supported the proposal?
I mean, I'm aware of the response to the consultation, but the initial tenancies weren't the only proposals in the bill to deal with antisocial behaviour. I don't think the time is right to proceed with initial tenancies. I think there's enough uncertainty just now with welfare reforms. I think what we're seeing happening in other parts of the UK where social tenancies are a short-term thing, that people have no right to remain there. They're being moved around, that they get a tenancy is social sector is only for a short time in your life and you have to move on. I think all of those uncertainties, it's just not right to do it. I also think that we've put enough protections in for dealing with the antisocial behaviour measures, and that with the other, we have, for example, people coming through the homeless route have the right to support for a tenancy, so they're getting that support built into the tenancy, and I think that's right and proper. And I also think that for people who've been waiting for ages and ages in a housing list to get a house that they can make into their own home, they all of a sudden are on trial to whether or not that they can remain in that home. So for all of these reasons, I don't think it's right to proceed with that measure. It's not, it could be reviewed in a future bill, but I certainly don't think the time's right, and I do think, I listened to the evidence given last week on it, and a lot of it was about antisocial behaviour, about tenants and landlords getting to know each other, and I think that can be done in a variety of other ways without putting people in trial.
Okay, thanks for that. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, if we move on to the part 3, the private rented housing. Jim?
Thank you, Convener. Good morning, Minister. The bill makes provision to transfer jurisdiction for civil private rented sector cases from the Scottish courts to a first-tier tribunal. Obviously, at the moment, if someone is pursuing a case through the courts, they are eligible or may be eligible for legal aid. How do you intend to ensure that tenants, particularly vulnerable tenants, are able to access advocacy services or some other form of representation through the tribunal process?
The tribunal procedures are designed to be accessible, understandable and less formal than the court system. And that's what that's the way currently tribunals operate, and that's the way I would expect the private rented sector housing tribunals to operate. People can represent themselves, people can be represented by family members, or they can be represented by friends, but also some people may have legal representation, but there will be many people who will be represented by, as you described, other agencies, advocacy services, advice agencies, and we will make sure, the intention would be that we'd make sure about what the private rented sector tribunal is about, and like all of that, where people can go for assistance, for help, and advice and representation with the private rented sector, and we will certainly be looking at that and doing that. But my intention would be that it is accessible to everyone, that they can get advice to go along to it. Doesn't have to be a legal representative. There are many other agencies out there who provide housing advice and advice in other areas, and I'm sure they will be involved in it as well. But we'll be monitoring it to see what the caseload is, to see the impact it has on other agencies. That will have to be monitored. But in my view, we don't need to put in the face of the bill how that advice will be there, but absolutely clear that I would anticipate that that advice will be there for people. It will, the tribunal should be accessible, and if people require representation, then they should be able to get that.
I take the point entirely, Minister, that this is a less formal process. And I hear what you say about ensuring that people are able to access the tribunal system. But what specific measures is the Scottish Government taking to ensure that that happens?
At the moment, we're at this stage in the bill. We will be ensuring, I hope my comments made it clear, that we will be making sure that that does happen, that they are accessible. That this is something that doesn't have to be in the face of the bill. This is something we will be discussing with the agencies that will be involved, with our stakeholders in it. But the intention is absolutely clear that the tribunal will be accessible for people. We know there will be people with difficulties accessing it, but we need to look at the measures that we can introduce for that, and we'll monitor that. But I don't think we need to put in the face of the bill how we make that accessible, because we have still to draw up the procedures for the tribunal.
Okay. The policy memorandum makes the point that the current system is one where cases can take a long time to reach court. Are you confident that the new tribunal system, which is yet to be established, will be adequately resourced?
I think we are confident at the present that it will be adequately resourced, because the whole ethos behind the system is to make access, is to make it more accessible, and hopefully that will also speed up the process. But the absolute priority is to access to justice for people who don't currently use it. We're confident. I don't know if anybody wants to comment on how the figures we arrived at. Dan, if you want to say.
The costings that we developed for the PRS tribunal are based on data and best practice from other existing tribunal jurisdictions, but we've also costed a range of scenarios based on how many cases that the tribunal can hear in a day, which should give a good range for the tribunal to develop properly.
The financial memorandum states that it is expected that there will be no additional costs for local authorities arising from the proposal to establish the tribunal. Is there anything you can share with the committee at this stage on what the likely budget and staffing arrangements for the tribunal will be?
At this stage, we can't do that. Sorry, could you repeat what you said at the start about?
Yeah, sure. I mean, the financial memorandum says that there will be no additional costs for local authorities arising from the establishment of the tribunal. And my question was whether you were in a position to share with the committee your current estimates of what the staffing arrangements and budget of the new tribunal would be.
I'll come on to that in a minute, but the staffing arrangement and budgets, because that will come under the tribunal set-up, but there should be no additional cost to local authorities in setting up the tribunal system. I'm not quite sure where that would come in, that local authorities would feel there's an extra cost to them in setting up the tribunal system.
There has been a suggestion highlighted to the committee in evidence that councils might have to train their staff, for example, or there might be appeals against landlord registration decisions.
my understanding is that that's only been one local authority that has suggested that, and we're certainly something we'd look at, but we don't anticipate there'll be any significant cost to local authorities in setting up the private sector tribunal system. But I'll maybe get Colin or Dan to talk about the other point you raised about the memorandum.
In terms of the staffing and costs for the PRS tribunal, in the financial memorandum we set out that the tribunal would need up to 63 members to hear the estimated caseload, and that there would be between around £90,000 and £130,000 in one-off set-up costs, and between £585,000 and £880,000 in annual operating costs thereafter.
130,000 set up, and what are the annual running costs?
Between 585,000 and around 880,000.
Okay, and staffing arrangements?
We would need up to 63 tribunal members to hear that caseload. Those are fee-paid tribunal members who give around 15 days per year to hearing cases for the tribunal.
So would I be right in saying then that the impact of this change is that actually we will be widening access to justice for people, so there would not necessarily be a resultant saving to the court service?
It is about widening access to justice. That's the intention of this, is to widen access to justice. It's not for us to save money for the court service.
Okay, can I ask then about another issue that we heard in evidence, which is that the private rented sector is to be covered by the new tribunal, but the social rented sector is to be excluded. Can you explain, first of all, what the rationale for that decision was and how you intend to monitor and evaluate the situation moving forward?
The rationale for that was that the evidence that we heard was certainly within the private rented sector that there was less tenants and even landlords taking cases forward through the court system. There's the balance. I think someone said it very well at your evidence session last week, that in the private sector, the balance between the landlord and the tenant and the redress is not there, where in the social sector you have tenants have got obviously a right to complain. The Social Housing Charter looks at the housing quality standards. There's a number of other areas in the social sector that can go to the Ombudsman where tenants have a form of redress which they don't currently have in the private sector, and it was felt very strongly that we should start this certainly in the private sector. The court reforms are coming in where they're talking about specialist summary cases and sheriffs, and perhaps Colin could talk a bit more about the court reforms, which we would want to see how that beds in for the social sector before there was any consideration of extending the tribunal service into the social sector. But it's very clear, and there's been very strong support for the private rented sector tribunal. Which is
there anything you can add to that answer in terms of the change to the court system in relation to the social rented sector in terms of the use of mediation services?
Right. Well, mediation services, I would have to say, is something that we're still looking at. Mediation services separate. We don't have to legislate for that. So in terms of mediation services, that's something we're taking forward in any case, is looking at mediation services between landlords and tenants. So therefore, that's something we don't have to put in the bill. But perhaps, Colin, you want to add a bit about the court reforms and how that would apply in the social sector?
I think it's one that has to be watched to see how it develops. The indications are that the Lord President, and of course the Lord President decide how the courts operate, is minded to create specialist summary sheriffs in housing cases, and that would be expected to have advantages in the way cases are handled when that system develops. But it's a work in progress, and it's something I think would have to be watched as it develops to see how it went, and also how it impacts on, as has already been suggested, things like mediation and the choices parties make around what goes to courts.
Can I just ask finally, Minister, does the Scottish Government intend to evaluate whether the social rented sector could or should at some point in the future be
transferred to a tribunal system?
What we've said is that we'd certainly look at how it operates in the private sector. If it does deliver what we intend it to deliver, and look at when the court reforms come in, if that has made any changes in the social sector or any impact in the social sector, and look at that. Certainly it would have to be monitored. And if at a future date we have to legislate or change further, then it's something which could be considered, but it's not something that's in the immediate future. We've got to see how it works in the private sector first. Does it deliver the outcome that we want it to deliver? And then look at the court reforms and see if there are further changes that need to be made.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Convener. Moving on from the tribunal, the other aspects of the bill relating to the private rented sector could have gone into a number of other areas, and I'd just like to ask what scope you see for the bill to develop over the stage 2 and 3 into addressing other aspects of the private rented sector. In particular, cost, rent levels. We don't have the chronic problem that we have in some parts of the south of England, for example, but in areas such as Glasgow, Edinburgh, and in particular Aberdeen, costs are spiralling, and that's becoming extremely burdensome. It seems to me it would be very consistent with the government's approach to cost of living issues, which generally fall under the sort of heading of the social wage, trying to address the costs that people face, to look at what measures could be put in place through a bill like this to address rent levels. Can I ask, first of all, what consideration has been given by the government to that issue, and whether anything is still possibly addressed within the scope of this bill? Or also other issues such as, for example, discrimination against people on housing benefit, issues around evictions and harassment, and yeah, I mean, I think I'll leave it at that. The principal issue I'm asking is in
the
rent levels.
Okay, in terms of rent levels, we didn't consult on rent levels. It wasn't an issue that was raised either during our consultation for the private rented sector strategy, nor has it been raised, I appreciate, other than by yourself, to me. We have a group just now who are looking at private rented sector tenure, and again, it's not been an issue that's been high on the agenda there. So in this bill, we do not intend to legislate in rent levels. There's no intention to do that. We haven't consulted on it, and nor have we had any, it hasn't been raised at all or frequently to us.
Well, I think it's possible organisations such as NUS will be seeking to raise that issue. They've certainly already made public arguments about that issue. But the tenancy, security of tenure issue that you mentioned in that, and the research which has just been published makes it pretty clear that there's not been a proactive attempt to find the views of people who have had negative experiences. Most of the tenants surveyed, I think it was a total of 63 tenants involved in that research. Most of those who'd moved on had moved on for voluntary reasons instead of that question of insecure tenure leading to people being forced to move at short notice. Can I just ask whether you remain open, whether the government remains open to this argument on security of tenure, because it does seem to me to underpin the inequality of arms, if you like, the power imbalance between tenants and landlords, which for those growing number of people in Scotland for whom the private rented sector is the only housing available for them, the only housing that our society provides, that inequality, that power imbalance is a really serious problem underpinning every aspect of their relationship with their landlord.
In terms of security of tenure, and I've said from the outset that we didn't consult on that, wasn't consulted on for this particular bill, and I've had discussions about this with Shelter and other organisations, and what I said clearly to them was that if the evidence is there, this is something that we will look at legislating on during, not in this bill, but during this Parliament. And that was said clearly. And we set up the first group, the group that's meeting just now, to put forward proposals and evidence and suggestions. And you've indicated that you don't think that the research was wide enough. So all of that we will be looking at, but yes, we're open. If there is demonstrated a need to change tenancy regime, then I'm open to do it, but not in this bill, but certainly during the life of this Parliament.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks. If we move on to part 4, letting agents, Gordon.
Thanks, Convener. I wanted to ask you about evidence we've received from the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, who suggested that the registration process for letting agents are largely based on those for property factors. They suggest that the necessary qualifications for registering as a property factor are too low and very simplistic, resulting in property factors with a history of malpractice are now legitimised to practice. What evidence do you have about the effectiveness of that registration system and its appropriateness for letting agents?
I think we're agreed, and I'm listening very carefully to what the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors have been saying. I think we want to be absolutely clear that any regulation we have, any registration, has got to be set at a meaningful level. It's got to. So we've looked at the Property Factors Act, and I do agree that in practice that may not be. We need something stronger for letting agents, and that would be the intention, that we have to have something, we have to set it at a level that is meaningful and can be enforced. It's not about just putting their name in the register and that's fine.
What changes would you be introducing?
We're looking, well, at this stage, I want to wait till stage 1's over and we've looked at all of the report, but certainly we'll be looking at strengthening what is required of a letting agent, what we're looking at in terms of perhaps, we're not going down the road that we think they have to be a member of a professional body, because that's about the industry then regulating themselves, because they would in effect say who gets in and who gets out of the register. But certainly we'll be looking at things like, training, qualifications, training, how they operate their business, a number of things that we're looking at. We've had a lot of evidence from letting agents, from the sector, and looking at this, and I think you may see changes when we come to stage 2. We're looking at this very closely.
You've said that you're not going down the route of letting agents being part of a professional or trade body, but can you explain who would be the visible policing body for the letting agent sector, with a purpose to inspect and investigate the industry and a bid to scope out unregistered or substandard practitioners?
The first thing, we're not saying that we're going to police the agency in terms of a regulatory body like you have with the social housing, the housing regulator. That was not costed, nor was it consulted on. What we've said is that letting agents will all require to be registered and registered with the Scottish Government, so they will not be registered with local authorities, they'll be registered with the Scottish Government, will hold the register of letting agents. The Scottish Government will apply the fit and proper person test, and what's in that obviously will be clear. What we would be anticipating, that's in terms of regulating how we do it, there will be the first stage tribunal can also look at breaches of the Code of Practice. The Code of Practice will be the key to this, and that will be drawn up with stakeholders exactly where the standard will be set, what we expect letting agents to be able to do to operate a business that will cover things like the training we've talked about. It may cover some of the other issues, cover issues in equality and discrimination, how we would expect letting agents to operate. So that is the intention to do it. We would expect either tenants, other letting agents to report an agent who is not operating under practice, because I think you'll find that if agents are registered and they're conducting their business in a professional manner in the way that we anticipate, if they're aware of other agents in their area not doing that, I think that will be very quickly brought to the attention of Scottish ministers. I also think that we need to do a lot more in ensuring that tenants know what we expect of a letting agent. So when tenants are going into property, a tenant information pack and everything, they should be clear what the letting agent, the role of the letting agent, what services the letting agent provide to the landlord, and also what services they provide to the tenant. And if that's not been done, then that's when we would take action. The Scottish Government will hold the register.
Okay, and finally, do you have any views on how the Code of Practice could help support the Scottish Government's aspirations for sustainable homes that help to meet Scotland's climate change targets?
I don't think the letting agent and Code of Practice will cover that. It's more about professional services and about quality of service and standards of service. It's not about climate change or sustainable housing. That would be covered in terms of our sustainable housing strategy when we're looking at consulting on standards for the private sector, which includes the private rented sector and homeowners, but that's not covered in the bill.
Okay, thanks very much.
Did you have something on this section?
For Convener, yes, just as the Code of Practice was raised and the Minister said that it's possible that it would address issues of discrimination, I wonder if I can encourage the Minister just to go a wee bit further in terms of what Parliament can expect in the Code. I've raised the issue specifically of discrimination against housing benefit recipients or welfare recipients, either in terms of advertising properties with a clear indication that housing benefit claimants won't be considered, or in terms of existing tenants being told that they have to leave if they're claiming housing benefit. Second issue, the workarounds that some letting agents are coming up with to get around the deposit protection schemes, charging advance rent or different ways of getting the same money coming in but not calling it a deposit. And also whether the Code of Practice could also address the reasons why a landlord might end a tenancy in that insecure tenancy regime that we have at the moment. Many tenants find that they're given notice to quit without any justifiable reason. Will the Code of Practice be seeking to address these kind of examples? Because that seems to me as about raising the standard of the industry as a whole rather than just weeding out a few of the worst bad apples.
Well, that's
apples aren't weeded. I'm sorry about the mixed metaphor there.
That's what the Code of Practice is about. It is about raising standards and ensuring that the standards are at a level that the agents can reach. But I think some of the issues you raised there can certainly be addressed in the Code of Practice. Some can be addressed perhaps easier than others. Certainly in terms of getting round the tenancy deposit scheme, I think we can address that in the Code of Practice. And I would want to address those types of issues in the Code of Practice. I'd certainly want to explore, because I absolutely agree with you. I understand your sentiments about the no DSS, no people in benefit. And I think that is something I'd want to talk to with the stakeholders when we are putting the Code of Practice together. It's something we can certainly discuss with them. And you raised a third one, you had 3 points there. One was
tenants being given a reason why they're being given notice to quit. Yeah. In that after the secure period of tenure, they're in an insecure tenure.
I mean, I certainly don't know if that's something. I mean, I would have thought that should be happening in any case, and certainly the Code of Practice should guide that any letting agent should be, and we talked earlier about training, they should actually know what the rules are and how to issue a notice of quit and when it can be issued, and tenants should know that as well. And certainly I'm more than willing to take that on if there's any suggestion that, well, we know that there are some landlords out there that are not adhering to it. But certainly in terms of the letting agent Code of Practice, we would anticipate that they would be following the rules and as regarding notices to quit and everything else that goes with a tenancy agreement. That should be clear how they can operate it.
Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thanks. If we move on to some other private rented housing issues, can I ask why there's no provision on the face of the bill to give other bodies, in addition to local authorities, third-party reporting rights to the private rented housing panel? And would this not help to meet the policy aim of expanding access to the housing panel?
I I absolutely understand where you're coming from there, Convener. Local authorities asked during the consultation to have this power and said it would help them with their strategic approach. But I do have some sympathy in saying that other people could perhaps do it. I mean, others can do it via the local authority, so it wouldn't have to necessarily be the tenant, but the tenant could do it with support of an agency or whatever and report it to the local authority. But there is provision in the bill for ministers to designate to other bodies a power to report to the private rented sector housing panel through secondary legislation, and I think that's something, if it's deemed necessary, we would look at, because it would, as you rightly say, improve that access. But it's where, if on the face of the bill, local authorities have got to be very clear that they're, but it's where and how many others would you put in the face of the bill, so there is a power in secondary legislation to do that.
Okay, and can you explain what action the Scottish Government is taking to address some of the issues regarding enforcement of existing private rented sector legislation, for example, the private landlord registration scheme? I mean, do you think that's working, or is the bill an opportunity perhaps to improve how the landlord registration scheme operates?
I think the powers are there under the existing powers in the landlord registration scheme for landlords to take action, for local authorities to take action against landlords who are not abiding by the scheme. I would accept that probably it's not operating the way that we would hope it's operating, but it's my clear view that local authorities have the power to take action against landlords that are operating against and using bad practices. I mean, we've all got examples where we've had people in our surgeries telling us about how a landlord's behaving, what they've done towards them, and they're still on the register. If there's complaints about a landlord constantly and continually when the house has been allocated or when a new tenant's moving in, and the local authority hasn't taken action, I do think the powers are there. I think it's about getting them to use those powers, and that's something that we certainly will be discussing as we move forward. I know local authorities are of the view that they have insufficient resources to do it the way that we'd all want to see it, but I do think that we have to remind them of the powers that they currently have and encourage them to use those powers. But I don't think we need to do anything additional in this bill, because the powers are there.
Okay. And can you comment on whether you agree with some of the suggestions that have been made to us to supplement the bill's provision to provide improvements to the physical standard of private rented housing, in particular, you know, clear how electrical safety can be achieved, the provision of smoke alarms being made mandatory in private rented properties, and the installation of carbon monoxide alarms?
Yeah, I think the safety in homes is absolutely paramount, and I'm very sympathetic to some of the proposals that have been put to the committee, and I've followed that. And, you know, I certainly would be interested in the committee's recommendations in that, but I'm very sympathetic to some of the proposals that have been put forward in terms of safety.
Okay, thanks. And then if we move on to part 5, in terms of mobile homes, we heard evidence to suggest that site owners could use the 3-year licence period as a threat against vulnerable residents. Can you tell us what the policy intention is behind the 3-year licence period, and what can you do to prevent site owners using this as a threat to vulnerable tenants?
I mean, certainly the idea of the fixed term licence was to protect the, I call them tenants, but the residents on a mobile home site. So that was the absolute intention behind it, and to ensure that the site owner was operating the site effectively, were fit and proper to do it, I know that there's been evidence suggesting that the site owners are saying to tenants, if we lose our licence after 3 years, you're off the site, and that's simply not the case. So we need to do some work in that in terms of talking to both the site owners and the residents in mobile home sites to make sure that that is not the intention behind it. It was to protect the tenants, and again, we're in a position where it seems to be turning. So we will issue advice and information to residents and to site owners as well about our view about this. And we are looking at it. I know there's been lots of evidence put to the committee from mobile homeowners. I've spoken to a number as well. So there may be some changes along the line in terms of what we're doing for mobile home owners as well.
Yes, because it's also been suggested to us by the park owners that a 3-year licence term could negatively impact on lenders providing finance to residential park homes in Scotland. So is there maybe not an argument for a 5-year five-yearly review and a kind of rolling licence, a bit like, you know, the care inspectorate inspect the homes and the area care homes that are less likely to meet the standards than those who are consistently meeting the standards, or with school inspections as well.
I think a couple of things. We heard as well about the evidence that it might prevent lenders lending to site owners, and there's clearly no intention that would happen. And we have asked for evidence in that. We have no concrete evidence at this stage that that's the case. We're currently speaking to officials are speaking to colleagues in the Welsh Assembly to look at that very issue, if that was an issue there, and we will keep our eye open on that one, and we're certainly watching that. But in terms of the 3-year period, the 3-year was deemed to be the appropriate period. It's a licence that will not, I don't want to use the word roll on, it might mean something else, but it's a licence that the bill says will be renewed automatically every 3 years unless the site owner has done something to breach it. So it's effectively what the home park owners are saying. It's a licence that they apply for, they get. 3 years later, okay, it's another application, but it will be automatically renewed by the local authority unless there's been any breaches. So, you know, we're not quite sure where that's, what's different from that as to what they're proposing.
Okay, and we've also heard that local authorities perhaps don't, there are different practices throughout local authorities, and whether, I'd like you to comment on whether you think local authorities have the ability, in terms of the resources, to regularly inspect sites and make full use of the proposed site licensing enforcement powers.
Well, I think that the bill gives local authorities an income stream to issue and enforce mobile home licences, and it also gives them to be able to claim back from the site owner any, you know, if they've had the cost of any enforcement action. So that's there. I think when we looked at it, we anticipated that the cost would cover a site inspection at least once during the term of the licence. But we would also anticipate that local authorities will concentrate the resources where they know there are difficulties and problems in a site, because some sites, as we all know, operate absolutely without any difficulty whatsoever, no complaints from either the residents or anyone else, whereas other sites, local authorities know, are the ones that are constantly causing the difficulties, and that therefore they would concentrate the bulk of their action on those sites to ensure that they're brought up to standard.
Is there any way that the local authority or the government can ensure that those costs of the park owner will not be passed on to the residents?
In terms of enforcement action, I think, I don't know if somebody in the legal team would be able to know if we can ensure that it's not passed. We can certainly look into that and get back to the committee on that. Certainly, if you're talking about if there's enforcement action taken, which the local authority then recovers from the site owner. I just want to be clear what you're asking. Can then somehow or other that be stopped being passed on to the resident? I don't know if I have that.
I think we expect the cost of licensing to be a small cost which will be passed on to each individual resident. I mean that will just be part of the costs, because that will be part of the site owner's costs. But we'll look into the specific question of whether the impact of a fine effectively isn't passed on to the resident.
Yeah. I mean, it certainly wouldn't be the intention behind us that the resident should pay for bad services that the landlord's been made to correct. So we'll certainly have to look into that.
Because effectively they'd already been paying for a good service anyway, and they weren't getting it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, I absolutely take your point there, that why would they pay twice for something? Yeah.
Okay, Adam. Private right housing conditions.
Yes, Part 6 of the Bill amends local authority powers to enforce repair and maintenance in private homes. Could you tell us how you think this sits within the context of the Scottish Government's sustainable housing strategy?
I think that's where it does sit, because it covers a number of things where the local authority can enforce the repair, which can include things like insulation, but it also sits in just keeping the houses to a standard that people can actually maintain and live in. It amends existing powers for repairs and maintenance. I'm just trying to think in terms of sustainable housing strategy. Out here.
I suppose it's about quality and improving the quality of the stock generally, and so in that sense it's going towards a more sustainable approach there.
Share
yes.
Proposal as well, which would solve one of the problems.
That's been a major problem, is the mission share problem in terms of getting houses brought up to quality and standard, and I think that would assist, and certainly local authorities tell us that's going to assist them considerably.
Okay, thank you.
And finally, in terms of the Scottish Housing Regulator, you did mention that in your opening remarks, but the people are concerned about the removal of the need to consult. And we just wonder, having listened to tenants, especially when we were out in Dumbarton in the Parliament Day, why you think the housing regulator might not have to consult tenants, because, I mean, insolvency or the threat of insolvency, for example, doesn't happen from one day to the next. It's kind of a build-up of whatever reason, but it's not something that is an immediate thing. So why are the proposals in the bill, and shouldn't we be genuinely trying to find means to protect tenants?
I think, this is seen as to be a means of protecting tenants, and I think I made it clear in my opening remarks about how important consulting tenants is for the Scottish Government, and is the intention behind this. This very narrow exception to the bill is a circumstance that I would hope would never happen, but it came close to it on one occasion, and we have to look at that and ensure that, and that's why we want to include that power. We see that only happening, if a social landlord is in financial jeopardy. It means that they could very imminently become insolvent, the lender calling in, and where a direction from the Scottish Housing Regulator to transfer the assets to another registered landlord would reduce the likelihood of that happening. Now, and again, there isn't time in all of that, so it would have to meet these 4 tests before we would, before that should happen. And what we've said is, if we can tighten that regulation any further and anyone. We have said to all of the stakeholders, if we can tighten that any further, we will. It tends to be an extremely tight piece of power that is only used in exceptional circumstances. I would hope never to be seen to be used, but felt that there was that ultimate protection for tenants, that that it was there, that all of a sudden it's not about regulation, this is about protecting the tenants to make sure that in those very extreme circumstances that they would be protected and they would have a landlord.
And there's also some concern in the sector about amalgamations of housing associations. Would it still be the case that tenants would have to vote on whether their housing association amalgamate with others, and where do you think this drive is coming from?
I think, as I said in my opening remarks, that the Glasgow and West of Scotland Housing Federation put forward quite compelling arguments of why in an amalgamation or a merger tenants should be balloted, because currently tenants are only balloted if they change the landlord, whereas if you amalgamate or form a constitutional partnership with a larger housing association, effectively you have the same landlord, but you're not required to be balloted to do that. And I think that's what we're looking at is, you know, in protecting tenants' rights, some of these mergers can make a difference to tenants, and we believe that for openness and transparency, perhaps they should be consulted in those circumstances, and that's why I've written out today to all stakeholders to say that we're minded to consider that at stage 2.
So we'll be seeing amendments on that from yourself at stage 2?
Possibly.
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 Okay, has anyone else got any final questions to the Minister? No. Okay, thank you very much, Minister, and your team. And can I, well, that concludes the public part of the meeting. We'll move into private.
No, we're still public.
Oh, sorry, we're still public because of... Okay, I'll just suspend to allow the witnesses to leave the room. We've got some subordinate legislation ahead of myself. Okay, if we move on to agenda item 4, which is subordinate legislation, it's consideration of a negative instrument on amendments to the Home Energy Assistance Scheme, as listed in the agenda. The instrument amends the eligibility criteria for grants under the Energy Assistance Scheme. The Delegated Powers and Law Reform Committee determined that it did not need to draw the instrument to the attention of the Parliament. The committee will now consider any issues that it wishes to raise in reporting to Parliament on the instrument. Members should also note that no motions to annul have been received in relation to this instrument. Does anyone have any comments? Okay, is the committee agreed that it doesn't wish to make any recommendation in relation to the instrument? That is agreed. Thank you. And now we move into private as agreed at the beginning of the meeting.